with his family, friends and colleagues on this sad anniversary. We are grateful every day to the police service and emergency services in all parts of the country for all what they do. We now come to questions. Secretary of State for the Home Department, David Simmons.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and all Right Honourable and Honourable members will also associate themselves with your remarks. In response, Mr. Speaker, it is vital that we help those in greatest need, including those requiring medical treatment and support, which is why we're working closely with local authority and civil society organisations.
David Simmons.
Will my Right Honourable friend consider making budgets available from the ODA funds to support refugees with their ambition to learn the English language after their resettlement to the UK?
My honourable friend asks an important question and makes a very important point about the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme. And he will know, as with all members of the House know, that our ODA budget is used exactly for that purpose. But also this government has a proud and considerable record in terms of its own achievement when it comes to the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme.
Nick Fletcher.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know at this particular time of emergency, the public are incredibly anxious around the provision that is in place, but I can assure my honourable friend that my priority as Home Secretary is to make sure the British people are kept safe, and of course that means working with our law enforcement agencies throughout this outbreak of COVID-19.
Nick Fletcher.
Is my right honourable friend as confident as I am that the police will have the full support of the British public during this difficult time?
Well, my honourable friend asks a very important question, and he is right for me to really put on record the fact that police are doing an excellent job when it comes to providing public confidence, protecting the public as well. And of course, this is an incredibly challenging time, Mr. Speaker, for our entire country, but also for everyone that works in our emergency services and our public sector as well. And of course, I'm here to back the police and make sure that we provide them the resources and the support that they need.
Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I associate the opposition with the remarks about PC Palmer. And I ask this question in place of my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Heeley, in order that we can have social distancing in the chamber. The challenges for police in tackling COVID-19 will be unprecedented. Will the Home Secretary consider relaxing regulations as the NHS has done in order to allow recently retired and leaving police officers to rejoin the force? Will she suspend the tax and pension disincentives to recently retired officers returning to work and include special constables in the emergency volunteer scheme provisions of the bill with access to the compensation fund?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable gentleman for his questions, and I can absolutely categorically say that the work is already taking place across government in terms of suspending the particular tax and pensions disincentives, because they are disincentives at this time of crisis and national emergency. We want to make sure that retired police officers, for example, can come back and join the force and join the service. I've specifically asked HMRC and the taxman to look at that, and they are doing that right now. Also, when it comes to special constables in the emergency volunteer scheme, absolutely, we are doing that too. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to give the House the reassurance when it comes to policing. I am working with MPCC every day, as of course as a policing minister, engaging with Martin Hewitt, but engaging with all forces across the country. That is the right thing to do. To understand the operational challenges that they are facing, but also making sure that our officers are supported. And thirdly, looking at all the ways in which we can make sure that we've got flow within the service, bringing people back with the right kind of skills and capability who are keeping our country safe at this very critical time.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my party, can I also echo you a very powerful words in relation to PC Keith Palmer. Mr. Speaker, the weekend saw a new but worrying development with significant numbers heading to isolated and scenic areas, the Highlands and Islands, for example, for the purposes of social distancing, not appreciating that these areas are not well equipped to deal with new arrivals as coronavirus spreads. So will the Home Secretary send a clear message that this behaviour is not appropriate? And while we don't want it to become a police matter, is she satisfied that there are sufficient powers available to stop that trend continuing, which can be used if required.
Hear, hear.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question and his comments. He's absolutely right. He and the public have observed very clearly the type of behaviours that we've seen over the weekend. It is not acceptable. The government could not have been clearer that in order to save lives and to protect the public during this public health emergency, it is right that we practice social distancing in the way in which the government has outlined, the government is reinforcing, the Chief Medical Officer and many others are reinforcing day in, day out. And with that, we ask the public to take responsibility. And of course, there are enforcement measures now in place through an SI that was put in place over the weekend when it comes to places of social gatherings and pubs and clubs and cafes, for example. The public have been observing those, but also the police, local authorities, trading standards are working together now to make sure that those measures are being put in place. And my final comment, Mr. Speaker, is that the guidance that is coming from the government and from Public Health England is there to protect lives and to save lives. I would urge everyone, all members of the British public, to follow that and absolutely not to use this period for any other practices. It is important that we observe social distancing and do everything that we can as individuals to be responsible in our own conduct.
Steve Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of my constituents have asked for a police presence at supermarkets. Will she agree with me that while there may be a case for an increased patrol around supermarkets, the main answer is for the public to buy responsibly?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and it is unsurprising that we've seen a greater demand on our supermarkets right now. But I think importantly, there are a number of points here. It is not appropriate for police officers to be inside supermarkets. And in fact, I and myself and other colleagues across government have been working with the Securities Industry Association, because they are the ones that provide guards at supermarkets and to look after the functioning of supermarkets. Of course, the answer to his question is that everyone should behave responsibly and make sure that we are being kind to people, but also observing the right kind of social practices in supermarkets.
Stephen Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I, through the Home Secretary, thank the MPCC and our senior police officers. We had an extremely reassuring brief from them in the Home Affairs Committee the other day and want to thank them for all they're doing. But could you say a little bit about making sure that PPE equipment is available to police forces across the country, but not only to police forces, but also our border force? We had some very worrying evidence from the Immigration Services Union about actions they were having to undertake without any equipment at all. Can she provide some reassurance?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question, and he's absolutely right. I mean, the work of the police is crucial, and I'm aware of the briefings that he and others have received. PPE is absolutely vital for all frontline workers, and there is a cross-government effort taking place right now. Yes, for Border Force, I spend every day with Border Force officials on my team, but also for police officers. Just last night, in fact, over the weekend, I was speaking to individual chief constables myself to understand what the challenges are on PPE. And of course, not all PPE is the same, depending on which service you're working in. And so we are absolutely making sure that the right type of PPE is going to the front line for the right type of workers. And where there have been issues with literally not supply but distribution, we are working across government to unblock those issues.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend Dorset Police and all the officers who are doing a fantastic job down in Dorset. Dorset being the most attractive seat in the House of Commons, thousands unfortunately disobeyed the government's guidelines and descended on Dorset's coastlines, parks and everywhere else, causing local residents to get extremely cross. Can the Right Honourable friend just reassure the House and remind the public that they've got to stay at home and not mix in the huge numbers that they were doing?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and notwithstanding the beauty of his own constituency in that part of the country, he absolutely makes a very important point that the government guidance on social distancing, self-isolation and staying at home is critical. It is critical when it comes to public health, protecting lives and saving lives, and I would urge all members of the public to follow that advice and guidance.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A large number of law-abiding workers in my constituency have leave to remain, but no recourse to public funds. Those who are going to need to self-isolate will only do so if they have support along with others. What plans does the Home Secretary have for that particular group during the current crisis?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very important point, and there are a range of measures that we are already working on across government and at pace, and rightly so, because obviously access to public services such as the NHS is vital, but also support systems. And working across government means working with DWP, which you'll be familiar with many of the measures that are currently being put in place, but also being looked at for particular groups in the way in which is spoken of.
Damien Moore.
3, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman has been a persistent correspondent with the Home Office on this matter. But as he hopefully knows, the provision of custody suites is an operational decision for Chief Officers and Police and Crime Commissioners who best understand the needs of their local communities. The Government is committed to supporting the police in their vital work, protecting the public and keeping us safe by recruiting 20,000 officers over the next 3 years and delivering the biggest funding increase in a decade to ensure police officers have the resources they need.
Damien Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm that police forces throughout the COVID virus outbreak will continue to arrest suspects?
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that. He is correct in his supposition that there will be extra burdens upon the police, but the Home Secretary and I are in close contact with forces across the country, and we are confident of their ability to continue to manage crime in the way they have been doing.
Rob Butler.
Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to group question 4 with question 10. Knife crime is a scourge in our society which leaves a trail of grief, anger and despair across entire communities, costing lives and leaving people afraid. That's why the Home Secretary has increased police funding by more than £1 billion this year, giving the police more powers to stop and search known offenders, started recruiting 20,000 more police officers and ensuring that those who carry a knife are locked up for longer. We will do everything in our power to end these shocking acts of violence and the senseless loss of life.
Butler.
Aylesbury Young Offenders Institution in my constituency has a very large number of young men aged between 18 and 21 who've been convicted of very serious offences, many of them offences of violence involving knives. And yet there are still many young teenagers who believe they need to carry a knife, wrongly, for their protection. What message does my honourable friend have for them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is quite right to raise this appalling issue, which, notwithstanding the current crisis, has dogged this country. And as somebody who, in my role at City Hall in London, 10 years ago, had to fight a similar upsurge in knife crime, he's quite right that we need to send the right message to young people. It is statistically true, I think, still the case, that you are actually much more likely to be stabbed or injured if you're carrying a knife than in not. And this is a basic truth that we need to communicate to young people.
Listen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What plans does my right honourable friend have to invest even more in youth facilities based in local communities like the city of Wolverhampton, because there is a strong link between youth knife crime and lack of youth services?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is quite right to point out that alongside police enforcement, we do need to do the longer-term intervention work with young people of all ages to turn them away from a life of violence and crime. And he will be pleased to know that the Government is making significant investments, not least through the Youth Investment Fund, to ensure that is the case. We want to make sure that all young people across the country have access to good, rigorous, disciplined, socialised activities that teach them the way of truth and light.
Neil Hanby.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are committed to giving all EU citizens living in the UK the certainty they need, and last week I announced 3 million people have been granted status under the European Settlement Scheme. To support vulnerable applicants, we have made available a further 8 million of funding to help vulnerable EU citizens, and for those who are unable to access the support mechanisms in place, including assisted digital, a paper application form will be made available to them.
Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've met with a number of constituents and organisations providing vital support to vulnerable people applying for EU settled status. Some of the stories they have shared with me about the difficulties faced by those challenged by an internet-based system, such as people with dementia, are harrowing. Whilst the news that funding to support these groups has been extended until this June is welcome, then a bidding process until June 2021, many of these vulnerable people are currently only able to secure pre-settled status. They will be required to apply again for settled status within 5 years. Can the Minister tell me where these individuals should turn to when the funding to support them is cut off?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as the member reflected on, we are making funding available, and current grant-funded organisations will continue up till the new funding thing comes in. And one of them is Fife Migrants Forum, I believe, in his own constituency. I'd also, like with anyone else, another member, I'd also invite them, if they wish, once the current situation's over, to come and visit the team in Liverpool dealing with the European Settlement Scheme and see firsthand the lengths they go to make all can get the status they're entitled to.
Diana.
On behalf of members on this side of the House, I'd like to offer my profound sympathy to the families of the 289 persons who've died in this unheard-of pandemic. On the question of the settlement scheme, we obviously welcome the fact that 3 million persons have been successfully processed, but ministers will be aware that the numbers rejected are on a rising curve, 300 last month, and this is increasingly because of problems about documentation. Last week, this House debated the Windrush Lessons Learned review, and one of the problems there was documentation. Isn't it time the government ended the uncertainty hanging over the heads of EU citizens and guaranteed the rights of EU citizens in the UK?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just say that the ones that have been rejected, there's a very small number, it says 300. I would say this is out of over 3 million applications, and the core reason for rejection, actually saying no to someone, is criminality. Where there is eligibility issues, people can make a free reapplication if they believe that they haven't but again, the evidence levels are quite basic. They prove your identity. They prove that you have residence in the UK, particularly for pre-settled status. And again, it's subject to the eligibility and suitability checks around criminality. So actually, the system is working very well. And again, I extend an invitation to her to come and meet the teams and see firsthand the work they're doing, and why this has been such a success, the biggest documentation of immigration status in history, and is going well.
Robert Corbett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 6.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to group questions 6 with 11, 12, 17 and 18. And we will not tolerate the abhorrent gangs that are terrorising our towns and exploiting our children when it comes to county line drugs gangs. And with that, we have committed £25 million of targeted investment to boost law enforcement to roll up these drug lines.
Just for the record, I think it's 18-19. Okay, Robert Corbett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend think that the COVID-19 outbreak might lead to an increase in the number of county lines gangs, and will she take some steps to address that?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he is right about the risks associated with gangs and drug line gangs and COVID-19. We're working with the police on this because, of course, the police are the ones on the front line. They monitor everything that goes on with gangs, and they will not desist in terms of the work that they're doing. And it's important that we pursue this work throughout this crisis to give public reassurance and confidence that we are determined to roll up these drug gangs.
Royston Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We hear plenty about the county lines networks, but not so much about the customers. It's simply not acceptable for people to pop down to Waitrose on a Saturday afternoon and buy their quinoa and then invite their friends around on a Saturday evening for some recreational cannabis. Wouldn't my right honourable friend update the House on what she's doing to try and disrupt the drugs trade, not just those that supply, but those that use?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The use of drugs is simply unacceptable. And the fact of the matter is those who misuse drugs and take drugs should also be aware of the consequences of their actions. Children around the country are being trafficked and being abused and used by drugs gangs, basically to fuel people's drug addiction. Now, there is a great deal of work that's taking place across government on this, including the work by Dame Carol Black, who had a review of drugs and has provided further evidence in terms of what other measures government can bring in addition to law enforcement measures.
James Cartledge.
Thank you, Speaker. Can I welcome our own friend's robust approach on this, but echo the concern of my own friend for Whitney, because obviously the concern is that with schools closed, children will have more time on their hands. That is the vulnerability. Can she assure us that that specific point, what we do to encourage online activities for them, etc., can be looked at across departments so that we can reduce the likelihood of this happening?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and it is important that we recognise the nature of vulnerability with young people and children. And of course, it is a fact throughout this crisis right now. Children are not at school, and they therefore could become prey to gangs and are equally more vulnerable. So we're working with the police to make sure that there is greater work that's taking place on protecting young people. We're doing the same with local authorities as well. But there is much more that the public need to do as well. It is a collective duty of the state to protect our children, make sure that they are safeguarded. And right now, across government, with COVID-19 taking place, we are absolutely determined to make sure that we safeguard children, protect vulnerable children, and ensure that more kids do not become vulnerable to county lines drugs gangs.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very good to hear the robust approach that the government is tackling county lines. The issue of dealing around schools, even at school gates, has been raised with me by both anxious teachers and parents over the past year. So, really, just can I ask my right honourable friend to ensure that when the schools reopen, her focus will be on making sure that they reopen safely for all of those attending.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and this is about protecting children, protecting vulnerable children as well. But also it's that safeguarding point. Everyone has a duty and a responsibility when it comes to safeguarding children. And of course, when schools finally reopen, schools will play a very important role as well in making sure that children are protected, but also getting them back into education, getting them back on a stable footing, and making sure that they're not going to be susceptible and vulnerable to these particular types of criminal activities.
Sally Ann Hart.
Mr. Speaker, Hastings and Rye has serious issues regarding county lines, with drug dealers deliberately targeting young and other vulnerable people. Sussex Police are working hard with local partners to combat drug dealers, but they need the support of the justice system, imposing strong deterrent sentences to ensure zero tolerance of drug gangs, particularly during the coronavirus crisis. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice are working together to pursue a zero-tolerance policy for drug gangs?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and of course through the Crime and Justice Cabinet Committee that we now have, we look at this now from an end-to-end perspective. So the Home Office is putting in £25 million specifically to target county lines drugs gangs and to roll up county lines, but she has highlighted a really important point, Mr. Speaker, which is the role of the criminal justice system on sentencing and deterrent, and also the way in which we work together to use intelligence to go after the gang leaders to literally cut the head of the snake, the people that are absolutely fueling this awful, abhorrent crime.
Nick Thomason.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And county lines is one aspect of the threat posed by serious and organised crime, in respect of which the coronavirus crisis will present huge logistical challenges. I'd be grateful if the Home Secretary could pass my thanks to the Security Minister for the discussions I've had with him on measures around warrants, but can the Home Secretary set out what other measures she will be taking to ensure our police can deal with urgent issues, including them having the appropriate protective equipment? And does she also agree with me that we need to ensure that this period in which we're going to be in emergency measures is not exploited by those who wish us harm?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the points, and I'm aware of the discussions that have taken place with regards to himself, the Security Minister, over the forthcoming legislation that will be discussed this afternoon on the floor of the House. He's absolutely right. I restate my points that I made about PPE in particular for protecting frontline workers. He will know specific to the bill. There are various aspects around the appointment of temporary judicial commissioners, biometric data and information, the type of essential steps that we have to take to make sure that we protect our people, our communities and our country. We can have no gaps and no loopholes so that people that want to do us harm come in and basically do us harm right now. And he's absolutely right that all focus collectively, and I thank him and the opposition front bench as well for the way in which they're working with us on making sure we have those protective measures, because the duty of government right now during this epidemic and crisis is to make sure that we do have the responsible measures in place to protect our country and our people.
Simmons.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the Home Secretary for that answer. Of course, the police are going to be under pressure in the months ahead and deserve all our support, and we should all say that any abuse towards the police is totally and utterly unacceptable. But there will also be people carrying out the role of police officers in the months ahead. Thanks to my honourable friend, the member for the Rhondda, the police have the protection of the Protectors Bill, allowing courts to take into account that they were on duty when the abuse occurred. Can we look at extending Protect the Protectors to those who are carrying out the role of police officers in the months ahead?
My other friend raises a very, very important point, and I'm on the record in this House in terms of my own views about the appalling abuse that our police officers and emergency workers are subject to. That is simply unacceptable, and certainly my intention, as the Honourable Gentleman will know through the Police Protection Bill, was to make sure that we brought in the right legislation to bring in enhanced powers and measures within the criminal justice system to make sure the right kind of penalties would be put in place. I agree with him on this. At this particular time, when there are additional pressures and strains on our public workers, our public sector, our emergency workers and our police officers, we should do everything possible, and I will absolutely look into that.
Caroline Ansell.
Question 7, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are extraordinary times in working hard to ensure no foreign students are unfairly penalised by these events. We recognise the concerns of the education sector about the impact of COVID-19 and are working with them to mitigate the adverse consequences. We are also working closely with secure English language test providers to ensure there is sufficient capacity for all those who need to take tests while prioritising the health and safety of staff and applicants.
Thank the Minister for his answer. And clearly my concern and my question was tabled before we hit this mission-critical phase in our actions to combat the virus. And of course it feels rather discordant to talk today about international travel when we're talking self-isolation and social distancing. But I think just below that there's another really important message, and that is that we will come through this and we will rally and we will rebuild. And so I thank him for his answer. And so I'd ask what measures are being taken to expedite particularly the time for those international students coming into our universities, because it's so very vital in towns like Eastbourne and across the country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognise the comments she makes, and as she says, at the current moment it seems strange to be talking about international travel when we are absolutely rightly advising against all non-essential travel within the United Kingdom, let alone abroad. What I would say is we're very clear, no one will be held or have a negative outcome through the immigration system due to a circumstance that was beyond their control. We have already done a block extension for Chinese nationals of their visas, and we're looking at further measures we can take, for example, allowing in-country switching that we wouldn't normally allow, to ensure that no one is penalised because they followed the advice and they did what they could to protect our NHS and save lives.
Christian Matheson.
Question number 8, sir.
Mr. Speaker, the vast majority of police officers do fulfil their duties to a very high standard, but where they fall short, it's only right that they are held to account. February this year, the government overhauled the police complaints and disciplinary procedures, introducing reforms to make the systems more accountable, proportionate and efficient.
Christian Matheson.
Speaker, I was disappointed to learn that 2 Metropolitan Police officers are facing potential disciplinary action for crashing their car while in hot pursuit of an active terrorist on the rampage. I know the Minister can't talk about individual cases, but is he satisfied that all circumstances are taken into account before a police officer faces suspension? And if he meets the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police anytime soon, would you mind passing on to her my personal thanks to every single one of the police officers involved in that operation, including those who are facing disciplinary sanction?
Mr. Speaker, well, I'm certainly willing to pass on his good wishes to the men and women of the Metropolitan Police Service, who we're in touch with daily, if not several times a day at the moment. He is quite right that I can't talk specifically about that particular case, but he can be confident that in that case and in all cases, the IOPC, who will be conducting the investigation, are well aware of their duty to take into account all the circumstances.
Andrew Rosendale.
Question 9, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are facing an unprecedented threat from COVID-19. In response to this, an enhanced monitoring process was implemented by Public Health England during the containment phase to monitor direct flights and identify any ill passengers from affected countries. However, the UK government does not intend to introduce port screening measures such as temperature checks, as the scientific advice suggests these simply don't work.
Andrew
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for his reply, but could he tell us what steps he is taking to ensure that British citizens returning from high-risk countries are fully aware of the need to self-isolate upon their return? And will he also promise that any advice that he is giving is shared between the governments of the devolved parliaments and assemblies, but also territories and dependencies? They all need advice, support and help during this very difficult time for our country.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. He's raising an extremely good and an extremely important point. As always, all aircraft flying into the United Kingdom will have an announcement on the symptoms and what to do if any passengers have those symptoms. And this in the UK has been enforced by a notice to airmen filed with the Civil Aviation Authority. In addition to that, the government has made sure there are posters and leaflets containing public health information in all international airports, ports and international train stations. The need to self-isolate where people have these symptoms is critical, and I will take up his suggestion and make sure that is propagated to all of the other administrations which he referred to.
Cooper.
Will the Minister and the Home Secretary pass on huge thanks to the Home Office staff, the Border Force staff and police who are working immensely hard on the response to coronavirus? Would he also accept, though, given that other countries have mandatory quarantines in place for people arriving, and the government in this country withdrew the previous advice on March the 13th for travellers coming from high-risk countries like Italy to self-isolate, it is hard to understand why there isn't guidance on self-isolation on a precautionary basis for travellers coming from high-risk countries. Would the Minister and Home Secretary look at that issue again, and would they also work with the Home Affairs Select Committee to ensure that they can attend remote meetings to answer our questions during this crisis?
Well, first of all, I would like to echo the Right Honourable Lady's comments about the fantastic work by civil servants and staff of various executive agencies. They are doing, as she has said, an incredible job under what are very difficult circumstances. In relation to the question she raised about sort of mandatory self-isolation when returning from high-risk countries, she is right, the advice did change. However, let me reassure her by saying it is under continual and ongoing scientific evaluation. The Home Secretary and I have both asked recently for refreshed scientific advice, and on an almost daily basis that is being monitored, and if the scientific advice says that the safety of our country requires a further change in policy, we will certainly do that in response to scientific advice. In relation to her question about remote hearings for her select committee, I'm sure that civil servants, officials and ministers at the Home Office will do exactly that if required, to make sure that her select committee can function and discharge its scrutinising responsibilities regardless of our current circumstances.
In previous Home Office questions, I've asked for reassurances from the Home Secretary that those who enter or seek to enter illegally from France are immediately returned, and I have not received that absolute reassurance. As there's a pandemic going on, it's even more important that people who seek to enter illegally are first apprehended, then returned, tested, and above all put into isolation. Can the Minister reassure me this is going on?
Well, there are very significant resources being put into protecting the short straits, in particular the crossing in the direction of Dover, and where people make that crossing clandestinely, they are met by relevant officials, particularly from Border Force and from Immigration Enforcement. And of course, one of the screening checks now being done relates to their health, to make sure that if they do need to be isolated to avoid the disease being transmitted onwards, that happens. In relation to returns, of course, we are currently bound by the Dublin regulations, but once we exit the transition period, we won't be, and there will be an opportunity for us to form our own policy in this important area.
Alistair Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, overwhelmingly people entering the UK and Orkney and Shetland do so because they're coming off cruise ships. That traffic is currently suspended as a result of the businesses themselves suspending it. But can the Minister give me some reassurance that if these companies were to reinstate cruise ship business before it was safe to do so, then steps would be taken to prevent them from doing it?
Well, let me reassure the right honourable gentleman that, as I said previously, the scientific advice is at the forefront of the government's thinking, and there is absolutely no question at all of any unsafe operating practice by cruise ship operators or anybody else being allowed. The government will not contemplate allowing that to happen until the scientific advice categorically states that it's safe.
Tom Hunt.
Question number 13.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to group this question with question 17. Burglary and theft are a blight on all members of our community. That's why this government is committed to reducing burglary and other neighbourhood crimes. We recently launched the £25 million Safer Streets Fund to support areas that are disproportionately affected by burglary and theft, to invest in well-evidenced crime prevention measures. And burglary, along with other neighbourhood crimes, will form one of the many outcomes that we'll be putting forward to the police that we expect to see as part of the recruitment of 20,000 more police officers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will know, following her recent visit to Ipswich, Ipswich has been seen a number of burglaries in our town centre recently. These break-ins have been targeted in stores in specific parts of the town, including important local businesses like Willie's and Willie's Cafe and Amelia's Hair and Beauty Salon. Given that Suffolk Constabulary's resources are stretched, and Suffolk urgently needs to review the police funding formula, what steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that the police in Ipswich have every resource they need to thoroughly investigate each burglary, bring the perpetrators to justice and prevent more of such serious crimes from happening in the future, especially in light of the additional pressures that tackling COVID-19 will place upon the local police force in Suffolk?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Ipswich has rarely had a champion quite as robust as the Honourable gentleman, and he's quite right to be as persistent as he is in the defence of his town. First thing I would say is I would urge Suffolk Constabulary, or indeed Ipswich, the PCC that represents Ipswich, to make a bid into the Safer Streets Fund. There are lots of things that can be done to target harden in particular areas where we know there are burglary hotspots. But I know he's aware that we've given Suffolk Constabulary another £9.2 million, I think, this year to start recruitment of police officers. And of course, there would be more to come in the years that follow. But he's quite right to keep up the pressure, and I hope he'll see results quite soon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Cheshire, the Police Rural Crime Unit recently reported having dealt with 170 crimes in 3 months, including burglaries and theft. So will my honourable friend guarantee that tackling these crimes will remain a key focus for his department, and that the extra resources being made available will help keep these specialist police officers out there protecting the Edinburgh countryside, farms and businesses into the future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I offer the Honourable gentleman belated welcome back from his extended recess. It's nice to see him in his place, and he's quite right to raise the issue of rural crime in particular. As somebody who represents 220 beautiful square miles of rolling Hampshire downland, I am well aware of the problems that rural communities face with crime. While he will understand that it's an operational matter for the Chief Constable in his area to decide where and how his police officers are deployed, I do know that some of the more rural forces are working hard to maintain their capacity in that particular crime type, and there is a, as he will know, a national rural crime network which is looking at what more can be done.
Morrison. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 14, please.
Mr. Speaker, we are committed to driving down crime and violence in all its forms, which is why, to strengthen our understanding of the scale of violence and abuse towards shop staff, we launched a call for evidence. The findings are supposed to be published this month, and it is still my ambition to do so, but we'll see what happens given the current circumstances. But we will continue to work closely with the police, industry and other partners to ensure a robust collective response.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think many colleagues across the House will share the concern that the criminal justice system can be too slow and too lenient in dealing with those that cause violence against shop workers and owners. But right now, can I ask the Minister just to share his expressions of solidarity to all those shop owners and workers who are putting themselves on the front line to help those in our community to be fed and looked after? And can we send a message out from this House that we expect those people to be treated not just to the level of criminal standard, but also with respect and gratitude?
Mr. Speaker, I wholeheartedly endorse the Honourable gentleman's remarks. He is right that when we emerge from this crisis that's engulfing our country, I think there will be a general reassessment about who is important in this country and what a key worker means. And he is right that those on the front line delivering stacking on shelves, taking money at tills, are as much part of the national effort to beat this coronavirus as a police officer or NHS worker, and we thank them for it.
Diane Abbott.
On the question of protecting shop workers and owners, as was referred to earlier, we've all seen the unfortunate scenes of disorder in supermarkets recently where persons are attempting to stockpile in response to the coronavirus. We've seen shelves swept clean just hours after the shops open, apparent shortages of very basic products like paracetamol, and the elderly unable to purchase their basic needs. We know a number of measures are being taken to deal with this situation, but we note that even when supermarkets try to set aside hours at the beginning of the day for the frail, elderly and NHS workers, others just barge them aside. No one on this side of the House wants to see police officers in supermarkets. But if the situation remains unmanageable, will the Minister consider talking to the shops and the supermarket owners and their security officers in order to see whether possibly patrols by community support officers in the vicinities of some of these larger supermarkets might play a role?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady is quite right to raise this issue, and I hope to reassure her that we are in very close contact, both with the police about what patterns of behaviour they are seeing, but also with the food industry more widely, and in particular with supermarkets, who I know are meeting with the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State at DEFRA on a regular basis to monitor the situation. We hope and believe that over the next few days things will settle down. Our food and supply chain in supermarkets is extremely strong, and we're reassured by those companies that they can fulfil demand as it comes. But she is right to hold us to the challenge of monitoring the situation. If we need to take further steps, then obviously we will. As my Right Honourable friend, the Home Secretary, said, we are also talking closely with the Securities Industry Association about the welfare and capability of their staff in these circumstances. But we want to make sure that this is managed proportionately and calmly, but we are keeping an eye on it, yes.
Theo Clark,
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are facing this country's greatest challenge since the Second World War. COVID-19 pandemic requires us to change our way of life for many months to come. And through this uncertainty, nothing has made, I think, us as a nation prouder than the extraordinary humanity and dedication of our police officers, firefighters, and of course our NHS workers and key workers. This battle against coronavirus is being fought in our hospitals and will be won through the efforts of the public who need to stay at home and protect the NHS and save lives. I know that on behalf of the government and the country, we're all facing this unprecedented challenge, which we will come through together, but also there is a role for compassion and commitment to ensure that we all work together at this challenging time.
Clark.
Over the weekend, I've spoken both to my local resilience forum and Staffordshire Police, who've raised various concerns with me about access to personal protective equipment and lack of personnel if people are off with self-isolation. So can I ask my Right Honourable friend what conversations she is having with police forces across the country to ensure that they do have the resources they need for dealing with COVID-19?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have daily conversations across the entire policing network across the country with regards to the resources that they themselves need at this incredibly challenging time. The government, of course, is also working closely with all partners, including the emergency services, on the range of issues, including the suitable PPE and the development of suitable testing. These are the things that our police officers and police chiefs are asking for right now, and we are working with them to coordinate supplies and also the policing response.
Diane Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to return to the subject of that category of person under immigration legislation who have no recourse to public funds. Because of the coronavirus epidemic and the consequent shutdown of large parts of the economy, these persons will not be able to work. We welcome the help for workers through bank loans and the benefit system that the government has brought in. But the category of person that I refer to are not entitled legally to benefits of any kind. I note that the Home Secretary is talking to the Department of Work and Pensions about this matter, but when can she give some assurance to people who are literally facing destitution that this matter will be resolved and there will be a way of offering them some measure of financial support?
Well, I repeat to the Right Honourable Lady the comment that I made earlier on. This is work that's taking place across government and not just with the Home Office. We are engaging with the Treasury, we are engaging with DWP. It is vital at this particular stage and this time that our country faces itself in this really significant challenge that we provide resources and support people of all levels, and that is something that the entire government is committed to do. And I'll be very happy to come back to the Right Honourable Lady on this specific point in due course.
Alexander Stafford.
Speaker. In light of the panic buying, profiteering and rising tensions occurring at some shops across the country, what measures are my right honourable friend taking to ensure sufficient security and public safety personnel are present to keep such premises open and to maintain the availability of essential goods to all, especially the elderly, vulnerable and our much valued NHS workers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is quite right to raise an issue that's been of concern in the media and across the country. And as I said earlier, we are talking to the Security Industries Association about what more they can do, and we're in close touch with, in particular, the supermarkets as to how they are administering and making sure that those who need to get resources can. We are monitoring the situation very closely with our colleagues in the police, but as I say, we hope and believe that in the next few days the good sense of the British public will reassert itself and everyone will start to behave appropriately.
Donald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the fact that no recourse to public funds rules appear to be being looked at just now, but there are a host of other immigration and asylum policies which surely also need urgent revision to deal with the coronavirus crisis. Immigration detention, requirements to report or attend appointments and interviews, and shared asylum accommodation are just three. Are all of these issues being looked at urgently, and could we simply receive a comprehensive update from the Home Office in early course?
Mr. Speaker, the answer is yes.
Steve Double.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that this current crisis is teaching us is that many people that we consider to be low-skilled are actually pretty crucial to the smooth running of our country and are in fact recognised as key workers. So would my right honourable friend perhaps consider that once we're through this situation, we review our points-based immigration system to reflect the things that we've learned during this time?
My honourable friend makes a very, very important point, and we've never said that people at lower skill levels are unimportant. And as we know right now, through this crisis, everybody is making a tremendous contribution and effort when it comes to keeping all services functioning and running, while at the same time ensuring care and compassion for workers and service provision that is essential right now. We will absolutely, through the points-based immigration system, as I have already committed, to keep all aspects of that under review. But the important thing with the points-based system is that we will ensure that points are tradable based on the skills and the labour market need that is required across particular sectors.
Bill Esterson.
The lack of sense of some parts of the British public, I'm afraid, is putting retail workers under enormous pressure and that threat. Retail workers cannot often be 2 metres apart from other people, especially at checkouts. This point was brought home to me by a constituent of mine who witnessed somebody being spat on for refusing to allow bulk buying. Can the Minister please revisit what he and the Home Secretary have already said about the need to protect retail workers? We are going to need them to continue at work. We cannot afford for them to become sick.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is quite right to raise this issue once again, and as I said earlier, the protection of retail workers is one of the uppermost issues in our mind. I have myself noticed the number of retailers who are taking protective measures with measurement on the floor, taping the floor where people should stand so they're staying 2 metres from a retail worker. But he's quite right that where there are more serious offences, action does need to be taken. But in the instance he mentions, as far as I can see, that's a crime, and it should be reported to the police and actioned accordingly.
Ben Bradley.
service is absolutely vital for our safety, and my honourable friend knows they do far more than just running into burning buildings to save people, including on wider public safety and public health measures, even more important perhaps than usual. What conversations has my honourable friend had with the fire service about what role they might play in supporting our efforts to tackle coronavirus, and can he ensure that they have all the resources that they need, both for this particular crisis and for the future?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and of course we've spoken quite clearly about policing today and the daily calls that we have. We have a similar system, obviously, with the fire service, who are providing incredible work and support, particularly for vulnerable communities across the country. We should all pay tribute to them. Their work is truly remarkable. We see them as an integral feature of the local resilience forums that cover all our constituencies, and of course we are in close contact with them to make sure that they are supported, getting the equipment that they need, the support that they need, and the resources that they need throughout this crisis.
Foreign national doctors and medical students at Morrison Hospital in Swansea are very concerned about their immigration status. They're facing significant bills if they want to renew their visas now. They obviously want an expedited process. Wouldn't it simply make sense if the government were to announce as swiftly as possible that they're going to waive all fees for such doctors and medical trainees, that they're going to try and make sure that those processes can be expedited and that anybody who wants to stay can stay?
Let me give my right honourable friend the assurance, and obviously his constituency assurance, and all public health workers in that category. There is some very fast work that's taking place right now in the Home Office, looking at exactly that, and I'd be very happy to write to the right honourable gentleman outlining that.
Faye Jones.
Thank you. Mr Speaker, a huge amount of tourists came flooding to my constituency of Brecon and Radnorshire at the weekend, and as beautiful as it is, Powys simply cannot cope with visitors at the moment, and I'm urging people to stay away, as this puts a huge strain on our already stretched rural resources, not least our police force. And so what can the Home Office do to ensure that members of Dyfed Powys Police and other police forces across the UK are protected as they carry out this vital work?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the concerns that have already been echoed in this House today. She does have a beautiful constituency, and she has an incredible police force as well, who I pay tribute to. But of course, the police have robust contingency arrangements. They have the ability to work with others in the community as well, to make sure, alongside emergency services, that of course we stop people from behaving irresponsibly in this particular way. But I restate the message that I said earlier on, Mr Speaker. Everyone should take responsibility, follow the advice from the government. This is about saving lives and protecting lives, and we all have a duty to follow that advice.
Robinson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Home Secretary is well aware that the emergency legislation being brought forward this afternoon provides quite extraordinary but important measures for immigration officials and extends the power of detention. Does she not also understand that without some adequate proactive screening, that power will be rendered useless, and will she keep open the option of providing a better regimen of screening at our airports and seaports?
Well, Mr Speaker, of course, we're working with the Department of Transport as well and across government on the issue of screening. But I think it's important, Mr Speaker, for the benefit of the House, to recognise that where there is proper evidence, scientific evidence, we are absolutely following that. But all of this will also be under review as things change, as more evidence from the Chief Medical Officer transpires. Of course, this is what we're doing across government day in, day out.
Sally Ann Hart.
Speaker, in times of extreme crisis which this country is facing, the vast majority of people will pull and are pulling together in the spirit of community and solidarity. Unfortunately, there will always be those who will exploit or take advantage of vulnerability and weakness. So what measures is my right honourable friend taken to ensure that the British people, our streets and our communities remain as safe as ever?
Well, my right honourable friend raises a very important and essential question about the safety and security of the public and our communities at this particular time. I think, Mr Speaker, it's fair to say that we have seen incredible resilience from the British public across all constituencies and our country right now. People are behaving in a very generous and community-minded way. Of course, that helps, and that's what we want to see. But at the same time, working with our police, our local authority, our local resilience forums, we are seeing organisations and individuals come together, and we want to continue to encourage that.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the weekend, I was horrified to receive calls from constituents telling me that some pub landlords were trying to let customers come in through the rear entrances of their pubs, leading my local authority after sending licensing officers to ask them to leave the pubs. Could the Home Secretary set out what punishment will be given to these pub landlords if they continue to flout the law and break these licensing conditions set out by the Prime Minister?
Well, in simple, Mr. Speaker, there are fines that will be put in place, but also for licensed premises, they run the risk of losing their licences and their livelihoods.
Mark Pritchard.
Speaker, the Home Secretary will know that COVID-19 has already had an impact on police numbers on the front line and in back office support. Can I ask her what discussions she's had or might have or consider having with the Foreign Office about those key workers, including police officers, nurses, support staff, who are currently stranded in different parts of the world, getting them back as a priority?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On police officers in particular, our numbers with frontline staff are proving to be very resilient. But my right honourable friend has made a very important point around those that are abroad and how we are repatriating them back to our country to get them back into the frontline services. That work is taking place across government, but with the Foreign Office specifically. And Border Force are now tasked with joining up with the Foreign Office to make sure that happens.
David Linden. Before leaving their country of origin, many of my asylum-seeking constituents were doctors or nurses and very skilled at those jobs. So given that there are such a shortage of nurses and doctors at the moment, will the government look at lifting the ban on asylum seekers to work to help take part in this national effort?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've already indicated to the House that there are many measures that are currently under review, and we're working at pace across government to look at some of the changes that we will be bringing in.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Speaker. Over the weekend, I was alerted to the fact that a number of religious workers, students and business people have visas that are expiring very shortly, and they're not able to return to India. What advice does my right honourable friend have for those people in that category?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will be announcing changes that we will be bringing in very soon on this, and I will not just write to the honourable gentleman, but I'll write to all colleagues about the way in which we'll be bringing in extensions and bringing that extension in very soon.
Mr. Speaker, the coronavirus is driving many aspects of our daily lives online. Hopefully that will help bring us together, but it will also undoubtedly attract the criminal elements for new crimes, and particularly all the vulnerable people going online. So what additional capacity is she ensuring in the police forces to patrol the online streets and keep us safe at this time?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady raises an extremely important point, and while we might see other forms of crime fall because of the lack of activity in the street, we are well aware and sensitive to the fact that fraud may emerge. I have seen over the weekend some reports in the media of unscrupulous individuals exploiting particularly elderly and vulnerable citizens, and certainly when we've been discussing these matters with police leaders on our regular calls, they are aware of that issue and are thinking more about how they could redirect resources towards that if it becomes systemic.
David Davis.
We probably have over 500,000 undocumented migrants in this country, people who, if they fall ill with coronavirus, may be afraid to declare themselves to the health authorities for fear of deportation. The Irish government, who have the same issue in Ireland, have firewalled NHS or their National Health Service data from other parts of government. I don't know whether this is the right answer, but will my right honourable friend look at this issue and find a similar resolution?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The point's well made, and we will certainly look at it. And I would say no one should fear accessing medical advice from our superb NHS due to an immigration reason.
Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Concerns have been raised in Croydon, and I've seen it elsewhere, that religious organisations are not adhering to the new guidance about having their services or not. And indeed, I've seen some people seeing it as an act of faith that you're bold enough to go and to your religious service. What more can we do, both in terms of enforcement but also communication, to make sure people are doing what they should?
The Honourable Lady is quite right, and I received reports just this morning that there are particular communities in London in particular who aren't observing the rules, and we'll be talking to MHCLG colleagues this afternoon about what they can do to draw people together to create better observance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just thank you for raising the death of PC Keith Palmer, who tragically died 3 years ago. The pressures on the Home Office are only likely to increase. We've seen 20,000 armed forces mobilised, many of them which will probably provide military assistance to the police. In the event of a lockdown, could the Home Secretary say what role the armed forces might play?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is quite right to raise the capacity and capability of our military, which is second to none. And where we can, we will draw upon it. He will know that this is a country that has a proud tradition of a strong division between the civil and the military, and we wish to maintain that. However, our armed forces colleagues do have superb expertise in logistics in particular, and in planning and construction, which we aim to use to the fullest extent.
Order, order. I wish to make a statement which relates to parliamentary services and aspects of the Chamber and other parliamentary business. I ask our honourable members bear with me as this is longer than I would like. Chamber attendance. Parliament as a whole continues to follow the latest government advice relating to COVID-19, including advising members and staff to work remotely where possible, and limiting all but essential access to the parliamentary estate. I remind members and those watching our proceedings that steps have been taken to preserve social distancing in the chamber. As a result, attendance will be more limited than usual, but that does not curtail the commitment of honourable members to fulfil their parliamentary duties. Video conferencing. We recognise the need to improve our video conferencing facilities to enable those working remotely to engage in committee proceedings. Regarding evidence sessions, these facilities are currently limited, not at least because the management of these sessions requires expert operators to produce audio-visual output of a suitable quality for broadcast use and enhance our transcription purposes. The teams who make such arrangements work are currently under, and I do stress, under significant strain because of staff absences. Further work in this area will be taken forward as a matter of priority over the Easter recess. Once the current situation is settled, I will commission a review to ensure we can develop systems to ensure we are ready and able to be more agile in the future. Catering. Some members and key parliamentary staff are still required to work on the estate to enable the House to continue to fulfil its important constitutional role. And as a workplace, it's important they continue to have access to adequate canteen facilities. The number of venues has been closed, but in those that remain open, we are employing a range of measures to increase social distancing, while encouraging diners to use takeaway options where possible. The following outlets remain open: tea room, terrace cafeteria, debate, dispatch box. Members, the members' smoking room remains open, but there is no service. I can confirm that from today, the sale of alcohol in the House of Commons catering venues has been suspended until further notice. I actually took that decision on Friday evening. All of these measures will be kept under constant review. Divisions. If divisions take place from today onwards until further notice, the arrangements will be modified to allow for social distancing. The entry of members will be staggered, with entry at separate times for 3 alphabetical groups. Members will be able to record their names at any of the desks. A division may take between 30 to 40 minutes to conduct it this way. Further details will be communicated via the whips and announced again if a division takes place. I just want to ensure that members all feel satisfied that we are, and all the staff are trying to do the best. I understand the wish for honourable members, particularly those not able to attend the chamber, to fulfil their duties to hold the government to account. However, I urge honourable members to think twice before tabling parliamentary questions. In particular, they may want to think about the impact of such questions on government officials who are working incredibly hard to respond to the current crisis. I've just got to say, if they are desperate questions, I understand, but multiple questions is absolutely blocking up staff members in this House, but actually government departments who need to be carrying on their duties. So please think twice. When a member puts 60 questions down, That is not helpful to anybody or this country. I should also mention that names added to early day motions which are not submitted electronically are not being processed. I am sure all honourable members will understand that in these exceptional circumstances, some changes to procedural services have proved necessary, and further changes may be needed. Conclusion. Finally, I want to again express my thanks to members and staff across the Parliament for their hard work in enabling that this House continues to function and for efforts in limiting the spread of coronavirus amongst our community. I've got to say, with some absolute heroes in this House who I want to thank on behalf of all of us. Thank you. We now come to a ministerial statement. I now call on the Lord President of the Council, the Leader of the House of Commons, to make the business statement. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Mr. Speaker, I should like to make a short business statement. Further to my announcement to the House last Thursday, the first item of business tomorrow will now be consideration of a business of the House motion, followed by all stages of the Contingencies Fund Bill. This will be followed by committee and remaining stages of the Windrush Compensation Scheme Expenditure Bill, followed by a motion relating to appointments to the Parliamentary Works Sponsor Body. The last item of business will be a general debate on the situation in Yemen, as determined by the Backbench Business Committee. The business for the rest of this week remains unchanged.
Honourable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank you for remembering PC Keith Palmer in your earlier statement. Can I thank the Leader of the House for the business statement. We agree that the Contingencies Fund Bill should be accommodated in this new change of business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the support of the Right Honourable Lady, and our hearts continue to go out to the family of PC Keith Palmer. It was a great sadness that afflicted them and the whole House 3 years ago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I say I welcome your statement and the steps you've set out to enable this House to continue to do its democratic role, but in a way that is safe and consistent with the advice the government has set out and is expecting our constituents to follow. Can I ask in that spirit to ask the Leader, if he's not able to update us today, to think about what further steps that can be agreed between Mr. Speaker and usual channels to enable this House to properly hold the government to account over what may be a considerable period of time when we're dealing with this virus, but in a way that is consistent with the firm, important advice we're giving to the rest of the general public.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend raises a point that is being considered by the government and will be discussed with the opposition and other opposition parties. We will need to legislate and we will need to ensure that the government is held to account, but we may well have to do it in ways that are different from those we have used previously. It is very encouraging to see that honourable and right honourable members seem to be sitting at least 6 feet away from each other in the chamber, and I would encourage that even on my own front bench, which is, seems to be observing the suitable gaps at this moment, as does the opposition front bench.
Patrick Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're happy to support the government in its efforts to get the Contingency Fund Bill so that it can make the expenditure needed to get the country through this crisis. And we welcome, Mr. Speaker, the announcements you've just made, particularly around social divisions, should we find, and perhaps we won't, but should we find that divisions are necessary. But it is continuing to put pressure on the continuing business of the House, continues to put pressure on staff, pressure on members. Can the Leader say what consideration is being given to bring recess forward to the end of this week? Because the reality is that any of us that return to our constituencies from London, the epicentre of the virus, are going to have to self-isolate. It would be inappropriate for us to go into our communities and therefore impossible for us to get back for sittings next week. So can the Leader please take that into consideration?
Yes, absolutely. I can assure the honourable gentleman that that is being considered. I would say to the House that pairing has been very widespread for this week to ensure that honourable and right honourable members who don't need to be here are not here. We obviously need to ensure that the emergency legislation is successfully passed this week, and that depends on the other place as well as here, and then the receipt of royal assent. but we will have other legislation to do in due course. But whether the toilets rate relief bill and the general debate before the adjournment is a central business that we all need to come back for is something that is debatable.
Greg Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Leader speaks at Cabinet tomorrow, will he convey appreciation to the Chancellor of the Exchequer for the package of measures to support workers that he announced on Friday? He may only have been Chancellor for a few weeks, but it may be that he has saved more jobs than any of his predecessors. But will he ask him urgently to come back to this House, I know he's working very hard on that, on a comparable package for the self-employed, whose businesses are crucial to every constituency in this country and indeed to the nation?
Mr. Speaker, I will do better than my right honourable friend asks for. I will ensure the next extract of Hansard recording the thanks of my right honourable friend are sent to the Chancellor, and his proposals have received widespread support across the country in the House. His point on the self-employed is very well made, and I will ensure that is also passed on.
Kovat Jones.
Well, can I also add my welcome to the support that was given last week to those in employment? But there's real anxiety out there amongst self-employed. Bill Croney, for example, one of my constituents, runs an event catering business, contacted me this morning. These people have got no money coming in, and I think people need to realise that. The government need urgently to bring forward a packet of measures, and I think an indication of a statement tomorrow would be at least, I think, a ray of hope for some of those people who are in desperate times.
Mr. Speaker, I would say that though the bill coming before the House tomorrow is not specifically directed at the self-employed, the scale of tomorrow's bill is that it will allow expenditure of £260 billion on account. That gives the government the flexibility that it needs, assuming the House is willing to pass that bill, to ensure that steps can be taken, and I know that my right honourable friend is giving urgent attention to ways of helping the self-employed. I think across the House it is accepted that that is something that needs to be tackled.
I also welcome your measures to try and keep all the staff and ourselves safe in this House. Could I ask my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, we're about to go into recess sometime in the near future. We don't know what's going to happen over the next few weeks, but undoubtedly there will be problems in all of our constituents. Can I ask him to urge all his front bench colleagues to treat any queries from any of us as if the House were sitting with the urgency that they are needed to be dealt with?
Mr. Speaker, may I refer to your statement, which I think gave the House very good advice. We, as honourable and right honourable members, need to consider what is urgent and pressing and needs raising with ministers, and what is routine and can wait until after this crisis is solved, because it is of the greatest importance that urgent messages get through, and they are not swamped by routine messages that we would usually be passing on to try and seek high-level responses. And I think self-denying by us will help ministers to ensure that the right responses are given to the most urgent items.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Could I also add my voice to those of the Honourable Member for Tunbridge Wells and for Durham in relation to the self-employed and freelancers, and ask that the Leader conveys to the Chancellor the urgent requirement for him to come back to the House with a statement in relation to the self-employed and freelancers, and also commend to him the report issued by the Musicians' Union today, which is outlining the impact that this has had on many people in the creative industries.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is right to raise the issue of the creative industries, who are mainly self-employed and have been particularly affected because, of course, the places that they perform have been closed. The government is inevitably conscious that when by order it closes places and that has an effect on people's livelihoods, there is a societal responsibility, and my right honourable friend the Chancellor is fully aware of that.
Mr. Speaker, you may recall that I have, over the last couple of years, secured not one but two emergency debates in this House on the Yemen, and have been a pretty staunch critic of the government's policy in respect of that country. But even I wonder about the timing of this debate tomorrow, and whether it really is wise for the House to be devoting time to that particular subject.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, who I know has campaigned to bring the attention of the country at large to what's going on in Yemen. it is always open to somebody who is going to move a motion not to move that motion, and honourable members may want to consider whether they wish to bring forward specific business.
Alistair Cameron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As things stand, we will be returning from the Easter recess just as this epidemic reaches its peak, or it heads towards its peak. Inevitably, either by agreement or for any other reason, a lot of members will not be here. So can I ask the Leader, Mr. Speaker, to take your indications with regard to the use of modern technology for distance working seriously over the recess, so that we might have the appropriate provision in place for members, which after all is what we are asking people in workplaces the length and breadth of this country to do.
Mr. Speaker, many aspects of distance working are already available in terms of e-tabling and so on. A motion will be brought forward to the House later on today to allow greater flexibility for the working of select committees, which will be an important step in allowing them to hold the government to account during this period. As regards the workings of the floor of the House, there will be discussions with leading figures in opposition parties, I hope during the course of this week, to see if we can, by agreement and consensus, work out how to limit the numbers of people who need to be in the chamber.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of businesses in my constituency are already looking to the future and are asking that when they get back on their feet, they are sadly going to have to make some redundancies because the business will not be turning over or making the profits they're making now. They're asking who is going to meet that bill. Could my right honourable friend ask the Chancellor what the answer to that particular conundrum is?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises the question that is at the heart and underlying what many honourable and right honourable members have been saying. How do we take care of businesses that were sound on the 1st of March and during this crisis may find that they are not sound when it ends? The government is doing everything it can to help ensure the continued soundness of businesses, and that, in my view, is absolutely the right thing to be doing.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the fact that on the 21st of April, when the House is due to return, it may not be possible for health reasons, is it possible to lift the convention that members don't usually lay parliamentary questions over the recess, so that those questions can be spaced out in a way that's sensible, rather than a huge backlog that might be put in next Tuesday afternoon?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes an interesting point, which I think is certainly worth us looking into in the few days that remain before we go on to recess.
Mark Pritchard.
Mr. Speaker, on the issue of the self-employed and freelancers, and following on from the Right Honourable Member for North Durham's question, can I ask that when a statement is given, hopefully it's a statement that comes forward quickly, given the immediate need of a lot of self-employed people, 6.5 in my constituency of the Wrekin, could that statement be forthcoming when the House is sitting rather than when the House has risen, in order that honourable members and right honourable members can interrogate constructively the government's suggestions?
Well, my honourable friend puts his finger on the reason why it is important for the House to be sitting, so that the government can be held to account and that questions can be asked on statements. I am sure that within the next few days, if there aren't statements from the government, there may be receptiveness to urgent questions. So I think that information will be forthcoming.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you. I welcome there's an indication of moving to more virtual ways of working, but could I ask that that also incorporates electronic voting as soon as possible? It is ridiculous that we're all going to be cooped up in those lobbies. And secondly, on self-employed, can I just reinforce the importance of action there and say in particular that the insurance companies need pressure put on them, because they are saying that because coronavirus wasn't listed as one of the diseases, they won't pay up. Clearly the insurance bodies need to be brought to heel here.
May I record my gratitude to the opposition for deciding not to divide the House last week. I think we have become aware that politicians in this country can act in the interests of the nation and of us all, and can come together to do this. And I think that we have shown that with surprising speed. And may I reiterate the thanks given by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, to his shadow, who has been particularly helpful in this difficult period. The issue regarding the self-employed is of great importance and has been widely raised.
Chris Brand.
I warmly condemn I warmly commend. I warmly commend the Secretary of State for Health for recognising that sometimes people on this side of the House have been wanting to be helpful in the criticisms that they've advanced, and there have been specific issues such as the treatment of employees, the treatment of those who are in rented properties, and for that matter now, the point that's already been raised in relation to those who are freelancers and sole traders. I think across the House, proper questions can get us to a better place. But my anxiety is we're telling the nation that we should bend every sinew to deal solely with this issue in the country. And yet in the House, we're still doing all sorts of other things which aren't solely directed to coronavirus. Can I suggest to the government that we shred every other piece of legislative process that's going on at the moment? We should only be debating issues that relate to the national crisis. And can you just tell us when we're going to have the votes which are necessary under the Public Health Act 1984 to enforce the measures that were introduced last Friday in relation to pubs and clubs?
Mr. Speaker, I won't make cheap shots about the Honourable Gentleman's default position when he's trying to be helpful. The difficulty is that some of the business we carry on needs to be carried on. I think it is important that the Windrush compensation scheme is debated and dealt with tomorrow. The Honourable Gentleman knows the procedures of this House better than almost anybody and will be aware that we need to have the Finance Bill introduced within a set period of the motions being introduced. And so there is routine business that needs to be carried out. And there are other things happening where MPs will want to hold the government to account. So while I understand his point, I think we can't go quite as far as he is suggesting.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But we can lead by example in this place, right here, right now. There are 4 people sitting within 6 feet of the Leader of the House as I look, certainly less than the 2 metre. I'll come over the tape measure in a moment. But my point is this: we have to demonstrate by our actions, and I think the visual example with people sitting immediately in front and behind other members does not give that. But my main point is about the self-employed. My honourable friend from Cardiff West mentioned the statement from the Musicians Union. When he speaks to the Chancellor about it, they have 2 specific proposals. One is an immediate payment of £400 to everybody who is self-employed per week. The second is to use the longer-term evidence in the records, in the tax records of income to deliver 80% of long-term income. Will he make sure that those figures are given to the Chancellor?
Mr. Speaker, I accept the point and encourage Honourable and Right Honourable members to try and keep 6 feet apart. I think we're doing pretty well considering how much we practically sit on each other's laps during ordinary sessions of Parliament. So I think it is a very significant and visible improvement on what it used to be. And as he has asked me to be the postbox for the Chancellor, I will of course do so, and I will make sure those points are passed on.
Stephen Deutscher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I add my voice to the chorus, those asking for measures on the self-employed, for the chance to come forward? Every single day that goes by at the moment is livelihoods devastated, and particularly the voice from the musicians and from the creative industry is absolutely vital. But can I, and I'll draw attention to my declaration of interest in that as well as a supporter of the Musicians Union, but can I ask the Leader of the House to urgently get a statement on the situation for charities? There was a very welcome set of measures by the Chancellor on the wage subsidy, but of course charities are expending large sums of money on providing services, not just on staff, and they face a 4.3 billion drop in their income over the next 12 weeks. Hundreds of members from 8 parties in this House have signed a letter on that. Can he urgently get a statement, whether it's written or otherwise, clarifying the situation for them?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for raising the plight of charities, which is well known to the government, and the wonderful work charities are doing to help in these circumstances. I hope Honourable and Right Honourable Gentlemen members will understand that the government is working through a very large number of issues and is doing it in an orderly way. I think the priority was rightly to give reassurance to those in employment so that we didn't face mass redundancies, which was likely, but that doesn't mean that the charity sector and the self-employed have been forgotten.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I also echo the sentiment on support for the self-employed? But a sector that's crying out for support and clarity is the aviation industry. In addition, we have bus and coach companies who have drivers on short-time working who are unsure as to how to treat those employees. Has the Transport Secretary indicated to Leader of the House will be making a statement in due course?
Mr. Speaker, I think the issues with the transport industry have been at the forefront of people's minds from very early on in this crisis, and I know that my right honourable friend is working very hard to try and find solutions for these problems, and I will bring this to his attention and point out there is an interest in some statement being made to this House.
Liam Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much associate myself with the calls from across the House for urgent action to help the self-employed. But can I ask the Leader of the House to bring forward a very urgent debate now about an issue that we've not touched on, and that is the need for urgent price caps and action to stop price gouging. Hear, hear. I highlighted an issue in my constituency last week where a disreputable chemist had increased the price of children's medicine by tenfold. As I highlighted this issue, I have been flooded with complaints about businesses, small and large, doubling, tripling, quadrupling prices. 2/3 of American states have legislation in place, activated in emergencies, that sets a price cap of 10 to 20%. We are obviously going to need such measures here, and the sooner we debate them, the better.
Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, may I say first of all that at business questions, whenever a large number of honourable and right honourable members raise one issue with me, and in this case it has been the self-employed, I invariably raise that with the relevant department immediately after the session, and I will absolutely assure the House that I will do that in relation to this session. On his second point, profiteering is extremely disagreeable. There have been times in our history when it has been illegal and subject to quite strong penalties. His point is exceptionally well made, and I will ensure that it is made also to the right person in government.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Leader of the House for coming and making a statement as well. Also want to put a record my thanks to the Chancellor. The issues that are coming to myself and to others in this House are legion, whether they're HMRC, employment, whether they're health issues, DWP, business, but the help for the small businesses which government has guaranteed is helpful because the employees are covered by the 80% grant or monies that come forward to cover their wages. Those are small companies, by the way, that are lucky to have their jobs because the small companies that employ between 6 and 16 people, what happens is their employers cannot employ them because there's nothing in the package that seems to help those people. So the employees are looked after, it seems, and thank you for that, but the employers who employ those employees aren't. What can we do for them?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman as always gets the nub of any matter that this House is discussing, and he is absolutely right. We are bringing forward packages to help as many people as possible, and the more people who are kept in employment, the more business there will be across the economy. But the scale of the effect of these closures on the economy is much bigger than anything that we have normally come across, which is why it has required this enormous response, including the announcement that I made at the beginning, that we would have a bill that allows for up to £260 billion to be advanced to departments.
Bob Seeley.
I'm delighted that my right honourable friend is making is going to go back to the relevant department when he about some of the matters raised. Can I add my voice to the importance of looking after the self-employed? In my constituency, we are going to be especially badly hit because of our reliance on tourism and the visitor economy, and many of those people are small businesses and self-employed, and our economy is going to be devastated this summer.
Mr. Speaker, his point is extremely well made and echoes what has been said by many other honourable and right honourable members.
Okay. We now come to Coronavirus Bill. Business of the House motion, Minister to move.
Formally.
The question is that Coronavirus Bill, Business of the House motion as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Coronavirus Bill, second reading.
Now.
Minister to move second reading. Secretary of State, Matt Henkel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that the bill now be read a second time. Mr. Speaker, coronavirus is the most serious public health emergency that has faced the world in a century. We are all targets, but the disease reserves its full cruelty for the weakest and the most vulnerable. And to defeat it, we are proposing extraordinary measures of the kind never seen before in peacetime. Our goal is to protect life and to protect every part of the NHS. And this bill jointly agreed with all 4 UK governments, gives us the power to fight the virus with everything that we've got. I'll give way, yes.
Well, the Health Secretary for giving way. Like many honourable members, I've had a huge number of issues raised with me by NHS workers about the issue of the availability of PPE to the frontline staff and also testing. Could he take the opportunity during second reading, because I know he wants to protect NHS staff through this bill, to update us, perhaps with any information as from across the UK, about progress on those matters?
Yes, if it's okay with you, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer that intervention and then get on with the point in the bill, because these are out with the bill, but they're incredibly important and very much a part of the topic. In terms of making sure that NHS staff and social care staff and those who need it clinically get the protective equipment they need, especially but not only the masks, we are undertaking enormous efforts to get that equipment out. The equipment is there, we have it, it's a distribution effort. And because I wasn't satisfied with the stories I heard of people running short, we've brought in the military to help with the logistical effort, but also because I want to hear from every single member of staff in the NHS or in social care who needs that equipment but doesn't have it, we've introduced a hotline and an email address which is manned. I've had an update on that. It has had a number of calls and they are all being responded to. And that way we'll find out where the gaps are to get this distribution out. So it's a mammoth effort. We've been working on it for several weeks, but the increase in the use of the protective equipment in the last week has been very sharp, as I'm sure he and the House will understand, and the logistical effort is a very significant one. On testing, we're expanding the amount of testing. We're buying tests. We're buying them, both ones made abroad and made here in the UK, because testing is absolutely vital to getting out of this. And I want to get to a point where anybody who wants to get tested can get tested. At the moment, we're having to reserve the tests that we've got for patients, especially in intensive care, so that they can be properly treated according to whether or not they have coronavirus, and very soon getting the tests out again to frontline staff so that they can get back to work if somebody in their household might have the symptoms and their household isolating. So I understand absolutely the importance of testing. We're working on it incredibly hard. We were working on it all weekend and we are making some progress. If I give way here and then there, and then I might make some progress.
Grateful to the Health Secretary giving way. I just wonder, on the point of testing, could he be absolutely clear? Does the current test available show whether somebody's got it and has previously perhaps had COVID-19? Does it do both, or does it do just one? And if it does just do one, when are we likely to have a test that does both?
Tests for both of those have recently been developed. The test for whether you have coronavirus, what we call the case test, that was first developed here by Public Health England. That's being expanded, but also the antibody test to test whether you have the antibodies that make you immune to coronavirus. That has now been developed, and we're buying it in large quantities.
Nobody denies this bill is necessary, but given that this bill gives unprecedented powers to the state to enforce isolation on people who've committed no crime, for the first time in our history, will the Secretary of State reassure the House that this House will be fully involved in renewing this once this crisis is over and there won't be any drift in this matter?
Yes. I'll turn to this point very shortly, but I would just correct my honourable friend, because the measures that we are taking in terms of being able to hold people in quarantine, they build on the 1984 Public Health Act, which are the ones that we've been using hitherto. So in that element, this bill is not unprecedented. What it does is it changes it makes these powers UK-wide, and it changes the basis and strengthens the basis on which they can be exercised, but are not unprecedented. But nevertheless, the point he makes about this House's ability to scrutinise the these measures and to ensure that we are, as a House, content with their continuation is an important one. If I just turn to that, because I'm just going to answer this point by making a little bit of progress, and then of course I'll come through. Because the bill is jointly agreed between the 4 UK governments, and of course there are measures that are significant departures from the way we normally do things, but they are strictly temporary. And I think that they are proportionate to the threat we face, and they'll only be activated on the basis of the best possible scientific evidence. Crucially, to my honourable friend's point, the right honourable friend. Yes, I thought so. Crucially, the legislation is time limited for 2 years, and the measures can each be switched on and off individually as necessary by the relevant authority, whether that's the UK government or the devolved government, depending on who exercises the powers. And as an additional safeguard, we've brought forward an amendment to give this House the opportunity to confirm that the powers are still required every 6 months. And we've tabled that amendment today. I'll give way here and then over there.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friends, and everyone admires the steps that he's taking. Just on this question of testing, he knows that I've been questioning and corresponding with him on this for some time. Can he explain, given that the test, as he pointed out, was developed in this country, why it is so much less available, it would seem, in this country than in other countries around the world?
Well, we have done more testing than most countries here. There are some countries that are ahead of us, and we're racing to catch up. So we've tested far more than, say, in France or America, but not as much as in Italy. So it's something that we're putting a huge amount of effort into, and I understand the pressure that he rightly puts on me to expand this testing capability, and we're increasingly using private companies to do the testing and to expand their production of the tests and the execution of the tests, rather than just doing it in the brilliant public health labs that we have at Porton Down and around the NHS. I will give way over there and then behind.
For giving way, and can I commend what he said about working with the devolved administrations to get the measures in this bill right. I think it's absolutely crucial that many of these measures are on a UK-wide basis. I realise it's unusual times. There's a specific power in Schedule 21 about the ability to limit entry into premises and to close down, again applying to all 4 administrations. Can you be clear about whether that will apply to care homes? Because I'm getting a lot of concern from constituents who are worried about some care homes that are still not restricting entry to individuals and therefore putting elderly residents at risk. There's a real demand for this to be unified across the country to protect the elderly residents.
We have other ways to enforce that with care homes, not least contractually through local authorities. I understand his concern, and to making sure that when people are in care homes, then they need to be protected, and many of them shielded from this virus, because many of the most vulnerable people are in care homes. I'll take away the point and to look at whether there's more that needs to be done, but we do have other powers that are available to deliver on what he and I think, agree is needed.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and obviously I commend him for accepting the 6-month review, I think it is, that he has just announced. But will he tell the House, in the event that the House decides that one element of this Act is working badly, will we be able to amend or strike out that element, or do we have to take the whole thing or reject it at those 6-month points?
We're proposing, as discussed with the opposition, a 6-month debate and vote on the continuation of the bill. And before that debate, we will provide evidence and advice from the Chief Medical Officer to inform the debate. And there is also a reporting mechanism for a report every 8 weeks on the use of the powers in the bill. I'll give way. Thank you. I'll give way over here and then up there.
Can I first of all thank my right honourable friend for the time he has taken in explaining every stage that he has used the powers of his office to this House and indeed to the people through the media. I'm hugely grateful. I know many others are. Could I just, however, state that over the last 3 weeks the world has changed in a rather more radical sense
than many of us appreciated. And the powers lying within this bill, even over 6 months, are likely to change and are going to be exercised in different ways. Can he assure me that not only he, but all other ministers will be exercising their powers and looking at them reasonably in keeping with only the coronavirus issue and making sure that they are limited to the purpose for which they were intended? Because these powers could, in different circumstances, be used in a particularly malicious fashion.
Well, yes, I can confirm that this bill is to deal with the current coronavirus emergency, and that is an important point. But I'd also say that although the world has changed in the past 3 weeks in ways that many couldn't have imagined, every measure that has been taken by the government has been part of the action plan that we published 3 weeks ago. And this bill, which of course has been drafted over an awful long time because it started on the basis of the pandemic flu plan that was standard before coronavirus existed, and then has been worked on over the past 3 months at incredible pace by a brilliant team of officials right across government. This is consistent with the action plan, and so whilst some people might have been surprised by each of the measures we've taken, they have all been part of the plan that we set out right at the start. But I can confirm to him that it's only for coronavirus. And I also want to give further detail to my previous answer to the Honourable gentleman from, I think, Swansea, who's on his phone. Thank you. Which is that Section 21 does not specify what it defines as a gathering or an event. It is deliberately broad, so it could include a care home, should we need it to, and that would be defined in secondary regulation, should that be necessary. I'll give way up here and then make some progress.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will want to support my right honourable friend in the provisions of this bill. I just want to reinforce 2 points. The first is that I am was very concerned to see the 2-year time period, which is why I signed New Clause 1 and New Clause 6 in the name of my right honourable friend. And I'm very pleased to hear what the government has said about the 6-month review. But notwithstanding what he just said about the period of time in which this has been produced, it is a heroic effort. 321 pages of legislation, which may well be subject to changes in the next few weeks and months as this crisis develops. I hope, therefore, he will see the 6-month review not just as a rubber stamping effort, but also a chance to improve the legislation, should it require that improvement.
Well, we could consider that. The proposal is to have a debate and a vote, as opposed to a whole new piece of legislation, and of course only to renew it if the measures in the bill are still necessary, and then of course they'll fall after 2 years. I understand the concern of my right honourable friend and his wisdom, and I know that as Secretary of State he dealt with some of these issues, albeit not here but around the world, and he knows the sorts of measures that are needed, which are contained in the bill. I'll take one more intervention and then I must make some progress.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and would he just clarify on the point of the 6 months? Obviously, for people who are chronically ill or have a serious disability, 6 months is quite a long time, and some of the changes are proposing social care implications with the devolved regions or with local government. What will happen if there is negative effects on people who receive social care within that 6 month period? What recourse will members have to bring that to the House?
There is recourse. I'll come on to that in a moment, because in the social care measures, which are very important, the purpose of the social care measures in the bill is to allow for a prioritisation of social care, should that be necessary. But there are a number of restrictions on that, because local authorities will still be expected to do what they can to meet everyone's needs during that period. So whilst local authorities will be able to prioritise to ensure that they meet the most urgent and serious care needs, there are restrictions to require them to meet everyone's needs, and indeed to fulfil the human rights obligations that those in receipt of care that those in receipt of care have. One final time I'll give way, and then I really must make some progress.
I'm most grateful to the Secretary of State in giving way. Can I first of all thank him for the excellent work he's done in ensuring that individuals get the care they need in these difficult, challenging times. On the human rights perspective, can I thank the Secretary of State and the Government for listening to faith organisations? Because initially, under Part 2, there was concerns that loved ones would have to be cremated. And as somebody from a Muslim background, and also the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief, taking into account the views of the Muslim and the Jewish community, it was completely unacceptable to look at that. So can I thank the Government for now ensuring that deceased wishes will be taken into account in relation to their final rights?
I pay tribute to my honourable friend who's worked hard on this to ensure that we come through with a solution in this bill, given the amendments that we've tabled today, to ensure that we can both have dignity in the case of a large proportion of the workforce not being available, but also accede to the wishes of the families and of faith, the communities of faith of many different faiths who had concerns with the way that this was originally drafted, and pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the Paymaster General, who found a way through which I think everybody can be content with. If I can make a bit of progress, Mr. Speaker, if I can make a bit of progress. Essentially, the bill gives all 4 UK governments a legislative and regulatory toolkit to respond in the right way at the right time and working through the action plan. And while I hope that some of these powers will never have to be used, we will not hesitate to act if that is what the situation requires.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and following on from the Honourable Member for Gillingham, I'm grateful for the work the Government has done in this area, because quite naturally many of my constituents, both from the Muslim background and the Jewish faith, were rightly concerned about this, and this is one of the major tenets of faith, and everybody has the right to have the dignity and faith in death. So I'm grateful for the Government to listen. But will the Minister also join me in this very difficult time for all our communities, the role that our faith communities and the difficult decisions that our faith communities are taking? Will he join me in thanking them for all the support they are giving?
I entirely agree, and in a way this exchange is an example of the cross-party approach that we're all taking. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for the work that he's done on this, working with the Paymaster General and bringing this point to light. I'm also very grateful for the work that he's done with many others to ensure that those who understandably want to gather as faith groups of any religion, understandably it is upsetting not to be able to do that. But it is also right that they cease large gatherings, or indeed any gatherings where there is social contact that can spread the disease. It's happening around the world. It is a difficult thing for some, and I pay tribute to those faith organisations who have made the right decision and the faith leaders who have done the right thing across all faiths here, and I urge all faith leaders to see what has been done by those who've taken the right steps and follow them. I also want to thank the honourable gentleman opposite for the constructive approach that he's taken to the passage of this legislation and the constructive tone that he has taken to this whole crisis. And just to reassure him that I listen to what he says very carefully. Even when he doesn't agree, he's done so in a calm, sensible and evidence-based way. And I think you can see from the bill that we've taken on many of his suggestions, and they go into law along with the Labour administration in Wales and the SNP government in Scotland and the multi-party administration in Northern Ireland. We've taken on ideas from all parties. The measures in the bill fall into 5 categories. 1, because we rely on the NHS and social care staff now more than ever, the first set of measures helps us increase the available health and social care workforce. 2, easing the burden on frontline staff, both within the NHS and beyond. 3, measures to contain and slow the spread of the virus so we can enforce social distancing. 4, managing those who the disease has taken from us with dignity and respect, and 5, supporting people to get through this crisis. And I'm going to briefly take each of these 5 parts in turn. The first part is about boosting our healthcare workforce at a time when it comes under maximum pressure, both through increased demand and because household isolation and because large parts of that workforce may fall sick. The bill allows for the emergency registration of health and social care professionals, including nurses, midwives, paramedics and social workers. And I can tell the House, I can update with numbers, 7,563 clinicians have so far answered our call to return to work, including members of this House, and I want to pay tribute to every single one of them. These are difficult times, and they have risen to the call of the nation's needs, and we know that many more will join them. Our thanks also to the social workers who play such a vital role in protecting the most vulnerable in this country, and the bill protects the income and the employment status of those who volunteer in the health and social care system. Volunteers will play a critical role in relieving the pressure on frontline clinicians and social care staff, and again, I offer our thanks. I give way to the Liberal Dem.
I'm very grateful for the Minister giving way. Is he aware that there are many in the refugee community in the UK who are qualified healthcare professionals? I've spoken to refugee charity Waive, who says they have 514 qualified healthcare professionals on their book, people who are willing to work, fully qualified in their own country, but there are bureaucratic barriers for them coming forward. Will you please look at this with great urgency so these people can help us out?
Yes. If he'll email me with the details, we'll get right onto it. What he calls the bureaucratic barriers are, of course, we've got to make sure that people are able to do the work that is necessary, but we have already shown in the bill that we're willing to both bring people back into service and also put into service those who are towards the end of their training to make sure we get as many people in full service as possible. I absolutely want to pick up on the proposal that he makes and take it up with the GMC or the relevant regulator to see whether we can find a way through for the period of this crisis. I'll give way here and then there.
I just wonder whether he may not need an additional power in relation to the Home Office being able to waive the fees for Tier 2 and Tier 5 visas for foreign nationals who are already working in the NHS and are about to have to renew their status in this country, or for those who've been studying as students.
It's already in the power of NHS Trust to pay those visa fees if it's necessary. Yes.
Also look at the immigration surcharge as well for doctors and nurses who are working in our ICUs, and also would he look to personally at the issues around research trials for potential new drugs or treatments or existing drugs or treatments that are being used, where I've had concerns raised with me that those processes are all being delayed by traditional randomised controlled trials processes, which may not be appropriate given the emergency we face.
Absolutely. This point is one that the Chief Medical Officer is personally looking into to make sure that when there's a treatment we can bring it to bear as soon as safely possible. Now, there is a challenge with a disease which has, thankfully, a mortality rate as a proportion of the overall population as low as this one, which is that you don't want to do more harm than good. But many of these drugs are already safe because they're already in license for another purpose, and it's a question of repurposing. This is on treatment rather than vaccine, and is something that we're actively working on. If she's got examples of particular barriers that we need to crunch through, then I'd like to know about them. If she could email me, I'll take them up with the MHRA. I'll just make a little bit more progress, because I also want to bring the House's attention to the professional indemnity clauses. Where there is no existing professional indemnity agreement in place, the bill provides legal protection for the additional clinical responsibilities that healthcare staff may be required to take on as part of the coronavirus response. I don't want any clinician not doing something that they can do because they worry about the indemnity and what might happen if it goes wrong. I want everybody in the NHS to be doing their very best to the top of their qualification to be looking after people and keeping people safe. Yes, I'll give way over here and then up there.
Secretary, and can I commend him for everything that he and his team are doing in order to ensure that we have healthcare professionals who are returning at the right time, which is to say when this disease peaks around about Easter. We're going to have to really move at pace in order to put the indemnity he has cited in place to ensure that people are physically and mentally fit to do this work, and crucially to ensure that they are skilled or reskilled in order to do what we're asking of them. Can he assure the House that those three things are being put in place?
Absolutely. All of that is absolutely in hand. He's quite right to raise it.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way and genuinely thank him for everything he is doing, and we are all rooting for him to be successful. I am genuinely worried about what is happening in London hospitals already and what that says about the prospects for the rest of the NHS. He's right to try and get staff to return, but we've got to be able to keep them there when they arrived. I've seen disturbing reports over the weekend of agency staff walking out mid-shift because they don't have the right protective gear and the right hand sanitising hand gel and the things that they would expect to keep themselves and patients safe. Can he look really urgently at this issue? Because London is really the story that will follow for the rest of the country if we don't get this right.
Yes, this is what I've been spending the weekend on. Absolutely, it's incredibly important. If I turn to the second part of the bill, Mr. Speaker, which is about easing the burden on the front line and follows from that intervention. This refers not only to the NHS front line, but to the dedicated public servants who guard our streets, who care for our children, look after communities in local government. In short, all those who keep the UK running safely and securely. By cutting down on the amount of paperwork they have to do, by allowing more remote working, by delaying some activities until after the emergency has ended, we can keep essential services going while we get through the pandemic. Some of the measures, Mr. Speaker, are difficult and not what we would choose to do in normal times. For instance, the bill will temporarily modify mental health legislation, reducing from 2 to 1 the number of doctors' opinions needed to detain someone under the Mental Health Act because they pose a risk to themselves or others. In circumstances where staff numbers were severely affected, the bill allows for the extension or removal of legal time limits governing the short-term detention of mental health patients. The bill also allows for an expansion of NHS critical care by allowing for rapid discharge from hospital where a patient is medically fit. NHS trusts will be permitted to delay continuing healthcare assessments, a process that can take weeks, until after the emergency has ended. The people who need this support will still receive NHS funding in the interim. The bill contains powers allowing local authorities to prioritise the services they offer, as we discussed earlier with relation to social care. And this prioritisation, while challenging, is vital. The measures would only be activated in circumstances where staff numbers were severely depleted. They do not remove the duty of care to an individual at risk of serious harm or neglect. We do not take any of these measures lightly, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope that many will not have to be used, but we will do whatever it takes to beat this virus.
For the Secretary of State giving way, being very generous. On the point of frontline care, particularly those working in intensive care units around the country, can I ask the Secretary of State again, press him again, when will those staff be tested? There are many staff that want to go to work but are afraid that they may be carrying the virus, and those that are at work, if they're tested and they have the virus, they want to go and isolate in order that they can return as quickly as possible to the front line. When are they going to be tested?
The answer is as soon as the tests that we're buying are available, and expanding testing is absolutely critical to everything that we're doing. Madam Deputy Speaker, this section of the bill also covers other mission-critical parts of public services, not just the NHS, including schools, borders, justice and national security. The bill empowers schools, for instance, to respond pragmatically to this situation, including the ability to change teacher ratios, to adapt school meal standards and temporarily to relax provisions for those with special educational needs. The bill also gives the Home Secretary the power to close and suspend operations at UK ports and airports, powers that will be deployed in circumstances only where staff shortages at the border force pose a real and significant threat to the UK's border security. It expands on the availability of video and audio link in court proceedings so justice can continue to function without the need for participants to attend in person. And to ensure that the Treasury can transact business at all times, the bill makes it possible for a single minister or Treasury Commissioner to sign instruments or act on behalf of other commissioners. At a time of unprecedented social disruption, it is essential also to maintain our national security capabilities. The bill allows temporary judicial commissioners to be appointed at the request of the Investigatory Powers Commissioner, and for an increase in the maximum time allowed for an urgent warrant to be reviewed from 3 to 12 days. This means that vital investigation warrants can continue to be issued and our security services and police can continue to protect the public. And I'll give way.
Secretary of State for giving way, and on the key points of people with mental health problems being signed off by one doctor and the question of children with special needs and a loosening of the regulations around that, what measures can be put in place, perhaps by local authorities or by others, so that there is a review mechanism on those two very important, crucial points for vulnerable people?
Well, clearly, these are issues of the highest sensitivity. It is important that we take these measures in case they're needed in the circumstances where staff numbers available are low, to make sure that we can get these the support needed as appropriate and make the interventions that are sometimes difficult to make. Because it can be, in some circumstances, far worse, for instance, not to detain somebody under section in the Mental Health Act, whereas where they are a danger to themselves or others. And if there isn't the availability of a second doctor because of staff shortages because of the virus, then I think it is appropriate. But the safeguards are an important part of getting this right, and it's an important part of why this is time limited.
He's been incredibly generous. Section 23 talks about food supply chains, absolutely crucial, and he'll have seen that many supermarkets are taking on additional workers to meet the demand that's there. But whether he could provide an answer or get one from the Treasury, I've had many people who are thinking of applying for those jobs, perhaps to make up loss in income. So even if they're covered by the 80% wage subsidy, whether they're able to take on extra work or they would lose the 80% wage subsidy from their existing job. Could he get some urgent clarity on that, because it could be deterring people from taking up those important jobs in our supermarkets and supply chains?
Well, that really is a question for the Treasury. My understanding is that the 80% wage subsidy is for those that are furloughed, as the Chancellor put it, as opposed to those who've moved into other jobs. But he'll have to ask the Treasury for a more detailed answer. I'll give way over here.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and also for all the work that he is doing and indeed the House is doing with regard to this essential legislation. Can I ask him, with particular regard to university settings? Seems to be some confusion. I've looked at the sort of Universities UK advice, but it seems to be that some universities just don't seem to be following this and seem to be requiring students to attend, notwithstanding the advice the country at large may be given.
I'm surprised to hear that, because we've been very, very clear about universities alongside schools. Of course, it's a matter for my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, in the first instance, but on the public health grounds, we made it absolutely clear that we were taking the steps to close schools and nurseries and universities and colleges, except for the children of key workers, where they absolutely need to be at school, where they, for instance, neither parent can look after them, but all those at university can stay at home on their own and don't need a parent, and so I don't think there's any excuse whatsoever. I'll give way.
I'm extremely grateful. Our local authority, the new Unitary Bucks Council, has made the point that workers who are furloughed in leisure centres may need to be redeployed into other council areas where they wouldn't normally be employed. This raises a particular problem that they really need to use the furlough scheme, take those workers out of the leisure centres and put them into social care, quite a different industry. Will he undertake to make sure that that is possible?
I don't think it needs a legal change in order to do that, because to essentially second somebody from one job into another is perfectly possible under existing employment law. In fact, the bill brings in a statutory volunteering scheme, which is essentially a new form of employment through volunteering, which is one way that this could be done. But I wouldn't expect it to be the main way, because if somebody was moving to do a different type of job because we need more people doing some things and fewer doing others during this crisis, that sort of secondment can be done in an entirely normal way, unless I've misunderstood my honourable friend.
Well, he's slightly misunderstood, and I hope he won't mind me saying so. The point really is that the council will be, all councils will be hemorrhaging money at this time, and they will need that 80% support with those workers who they would otherwise furlough, so they can then use them as volunteers. The point is to constrain cost.
Okay. I'll take that up with the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I'll give way one more time and then make some further progress.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Whilst we understand that these are exceptional circumstances, there is understandably grave concern about the lowering of social care standards. We are talking about some of the most vulnerable in our society, the elderly and disabled of all ages, and having the human rights, the Convention on Human Rights as a backup could see care standards lowered to a dangerously low level, putting these people at risk. Could the Secretary of State outline what will be the thresholds for turning these powers on and indeed back off again to ensure that these do not become the new norm?
The threshold is about the amount of staff shortages that there might be, and I would gently, Madam Deputy Speaker, say to the Honourable Lady, I understand her concerns, but in fact the purpose of these is precisely the opposite. It's to make sure that those who need social care, when there is a shortage of social care workers, those who need social care to live their everyday life can get it, and that they can be prioritised over and above those who have a current legal obligation to legal right to social care under the Care Act 2014, but for whom it is not a matter of life and death. So this is absolutely about prioritising the vulnerable, and that's the purpose of the legislation. But I understand where she's coming from, and that's why we've put the safeguards in place to ensure that the prioritisation is as intended. If I could just, yes, one more, and then I'll move on.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for my right friend for giving way. I want to ask a generalised question about the supply of medicine. Paul Howard, a consultant in palliative medicine at our excellent hospice on the island, says that under patient group direction, that's group prescriptions, nurses can give out morphine, but due to a quirk in the rules, they can't give similar powerful opiate painkillers. My question is, will this bill enable nurses to give controlled drugs as part of patient group direction, specifically just in case medical supplies run short, but specifically also because we are reliant on ferries on the island and it gives us slightly more diversity in patient treatment?
Well, I'll look into the specific point that he makes. There are parts of the bill that would help to tackle the problem that he describes if it's appropriate to do so. But I think it's better if I get some medical advice and get back to him. The third part of the bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, are measures to slow the spread of the virus. As this disease accelerates, our goal is to protect life, to protect the vulnerable, and to protect the NHS by flattening the curve and minimising unnecessary social contact. This is a national effort, and everyone has their part to play. Self-isolating if you or anyone in your house has symptoms, working from home wherever possible, avoiding social gatherings, and of course, regularly washing your hands. And the bill provides for us to go further. It gives us stronger powers to restrict or prohibit events and public gatherings, and where necessary, to shut down premises. The bill gives the police and border force the power to isolate a person who is or may be infectious. And this part of the bill also allows us to close education settings or childcare providers and to postpone elections that were due to take place in England in May this year for 1 year. And these measures, Madam Deputy Speaker, are not measures anyone would want to take, but they are absolutely necessary in this crisis. I'll give way there and then here.
To the Secretary of State of giving way, he will be aware that over the weekend thousands of people made the distance to holiday areas and rural areas such as mine. Can I just ask him, in terms of Schedule 21, do the powers there allow ministers to require people, in the circumstances where local health boards are saying that they are under increased pressure, to remain in their primary residences?
It's a really important point, because we have advised against all unnecessary travel, and I don't regard going to your holiday home in Wales as a necessary journey. There is a risk of putting extra pressure on the NHS in rural areas from large numbers of people going to second homes, and so I entirely understand the concern that the Honourable Gentle has raised, and the powers do allow for a constable to take somebody to a place in order to prevent the spread of the infection. And making sure, therefore, that we can police the public health guidance that we've given, and we've been absolutely clear over the last few days that if people do not follow this advice, then we will not hesitate to act. And we did this last week with pubs and clubs and restaurants, where we said that people shouldn't go. It was clear that some were still open, and so we then took the decision to close them down with the enforcement powers for the police and trading standards, and this bill provides those powers more broadly. I'll give way to the front bench of the Scottish National Party.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State, and I'm pleased with what he's said. This is a very significant problem. I've had more than 1,000 emails over the weekend from constituents that are petrified as to what is going on. The Highland area is more than 10% of the UK landmass. We have one acute hospital in Inverness. Some of these tourist destinations are more than 3 hours from Inverness. We have been absolutely inundated with people that show no concern for the local population. People that are saying that they've now been denied the right to travel to the islands by ferry because we've stopped it, that they're going to come to Skye. This is a dangerous, dangerous situation where they're imperiling the lives of our constituents. They must go home and they must stay at home, and I'm sure the Secretary of State would agree.
Well, what can I say? I am concerned that people not following the public health advice.
And to the Secretary of State for giving way. Some holiday companies have been responsible. So Sykes Cottages, for example, has cancelled a whole raft of bookings for weeks ahead. But my honourable friend, the member for West Ham, raises by phone the fact that there are lots of Airbnb bookings still available in holiday resorts. Surely this is irresponsible. If the companies won't do the responsible things by limiting access to holiday properties, does this bill give the government to act? And if so, will the government act to stop this kind of behaviour?
Well, if it is deemed a risk to public health, then this bill does give the potential power through secondary legislation to take action if that is needed. I'll give way here and then here.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, and I mean this in a constructive way, but it does feel that we are constantly behind the curve. We are always waiting for people not to do what we've asked them to do before we then step in and try to introduce more strict communications. And so I would beg him, will he underpin this legislation and everything else the government is doing with a much bigger, wider, louder, more comprehensive public education campaign? Because right now it clearly is not getting through. Anyone who is looking at the coverage over the weekend around people gathering in Richmond Park and elsewhere will know that it's not being heard. We need to be doing an awful lot more to be able to catch up and get ahead of this.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there is the most comprehensive public communications campaign probably in the history of government peacetime communications, and maybe I'll send a poster to the Honourable Lady. Yes.
My right honourable friend, the issue around Brits seeking to isolate in remoter parts of this country is a big issue for me again in Rutland. Over the weekend I went around the constituency, I saw pile after car, I saw caravan parks open and hotels advertising for self-isolation holidays and breaks within my constituency. So can he just confirm, for the benefit of all those in the House, that the current guidance is that people should stay in their own homes and should not be travelling for self-isolation holidays or anything of the sort?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with my honourable friend. If I can turn, Madam, I'll take one more intervention, and then, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I might make some progress.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State being very generous, but these are important issues. On the issue of social distancing, is there something that he feels might happen tomorrow that currently isn't happening today as far as people's behaviour is concerned? People gathering in their thousands on the beautiful landmark of the Wrekin in my constituency. It's right that people should have exercise, physical, mental health and well-being, but social distancing is not being followed by many, and whether it be the Wrekin, whether it be Holland Park or Hyde Park or St James Park, or in counties around this House today, can I ask what behavioural changes he expects? Is it not the case that we will have lockdown, and isn't it better to have it today rather than next week?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and we're absolutely clear that we're prepared to take the action that is necessary. I'm going to make some progress. The fourth part of the bill contains measures for managing the deceased in circumstances where many of those involved in the registration and management of death will themselves be self-isolating. And we want to ensure that those taken from us by the virus are treated with the utmost dignity, while protecting public health, of course, and respecting the wishes of bereaved families. Among other measures, the bill will expand the list of people who can register a death to include funeral directors. It will mean that coroners can only have to be notified where there isn't a medical professional available to sign a death certificate. It'll allow death certificates to be emailed instead of physically presented. It'll remove the need for a second confirmatory medical certificate in order for a cremation to take place. And the bill gives local authorities the power to take control of elements of the process if needed. These powers would only be used if absolutely necessary and on clinical advice. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, we plan for the worst, even while we work for the best. I'll give way and then make some further progress.
So we'll know that the new medical examiner has been introduced in many areas, including in Durham. They have a role of looking into deaths in hospitals. Clearly, their role is going to be inundated if you get large numbers of deaths. Is there anything in the bill that loosens up their role? Because otherwise they're going to be overwhelmed by the number of examinations they'll have to do.
Well, I very much hope that they won't, and the medical examiners regime is a very successful one that, as he says, we're expanding across the country, and we don't deem it necessary, not least because we think that we can expand that if necessary. So we don't think that there's need for a statutory change in what is an area that's improving. I'm going to turn now to the fifth and final part. I'll give one more time, and then...
I'm very grateful. It's just... Obviously, there may be instances where it's impossible to allow for a normal funeral in the way that one would be used to having, and it might be that there have to be mass funerals, or for that matter, that there might have to be instances where just one person is allowed to attend apart from the celebrant themselves. I wonder whether it might be possible to ensure in all local authorities, in particular in crematoria, that it's possible to film such moments so that at least loved ones have an opportunity to feel that they're somehow engaged and online, if not in person.
I know that the Honourable gentleman speaks from experience of having presided over these events, and yes, that is available and increasingly available, and I entirely understand why many people would want that. The fifth and final part of the bill includes measures to protect and support people through this crisis. This is not an exhaustive list of everything we plan to do, but the principle is that no one should be punished for doing the right thing and self-isolating if they or someone in their household has symptoms. And to make that happen, the bill will ensure that statutory sick pay is paid from day one, and this will be applied retrospectively from the 13th of March. Small businesses with fewer than 250 employees will get a full refund for sick pay relating to coronavirus during the course of the emergency. And finally, the bill will require industry to provide information about food supplies. This all comes alongside our plan for people's jobs and incomes announced by the Chancellor on Friday. The bill allows the 4 UK governments to activate these powers when they're needed and deactivate them when they are no longer needed. We ask for these powers as a whole to protect life. We'll relinquish them as soon as the threat to life from coronavirus has passed. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill means we can do the right thing at the right time, guided by the best possible science. That science gets better every day. This disease can isolate us, but it cannot separate us from the ties that bind us together. And with patience and resolve, and with the painstaking use of data and evidence, with the whole nation working together as one united kingdom, we will get through this, and I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Shadow Secretary of State Jonathan Ashworth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I start by putting on record my thanks to the Secretary of State for his kind words, but also for the way in which he has continued to keep me updated throughout this process, for the arrangements he has made for us to be briefed by officials and the Chief Medical Officer, for keeping me informed of government decisions and for ongoing engagement with the bill. And I hope that he understands, and indeed members across the House understand, that when we ask the Secretary of State probing questions, we do so constructively, and we do so not to undermine the Secretary of State or to create some false dividing line for the sake of political point scoring. We do so because this is a frightening time for our constituents, and we all have an interest in ensuring that the government get this right, and we want the government to succeed in defeating this virus. Can I just make a few remarks about the position as to where we are responding to the virus before moving on to some specific comments about the bill? But as always, our thoughts are again with those who have lost loved ones to the virus, and again we put on record our praise for the extraordinary efforts of our NHS staff and other dedicated public servants. This unprecedented global health crisis tests each and every one of them like never before. We are forever in their debt. And today, this House is being asked to make decisions of a magnitude I simply would never have dreamt of only a few weeks ago. And I know no member came into this place to put powers like this onto the statute book, powers that curtail so many basic freedoms that our forebears fought so hard for, and so many today take for granted. But I also know that every member here will want to do all they can to support all means necessary to save lives and protect our communities in the face of this virus. This is a global health emergency, the like of which the world has never seen since the Spanish flu outbreak over 100 years ago. Throughout this outbreak, I have said this virus spreads rapidly, it exploits ambivalence, it thrives on inequality. And the government has quite rightly, quite correctly, sought to promote social distancing as a means to reduce person-to-person transmission of the virus. These measures have been, for the most part, on a purely voluntary basis. But still, too many, I am afraid, are not following the advice. We'll all have seen this weekend the pictures of bustling markets, packed tube trains, busy beaches and parks. I'm afraid the public health messages still are not being heard loud and clear. Everyone who can be at home should be at home. Everyone who can must work from home if they can. And this House must also send a clear message to young people, to millennials, that they are not invulnerable either to this virus. They are at risk too. And to be frank, Madam Deputy Speaker, we in this House need to adjust our behaviour as well. I love and respect this chamber. I think members will agree that I relish the cut and thrust of robust debate across these dispatch boxes. But if other workplaces can use Zoom calls and Skype and conference calling and so on to make decisions, then why can't we? So I do look forward to the reforms that Mr. Speaker is looking into. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful, and can I also thank him and the Secretary of State, who are remiss not to do so, for the way in which they are both responding to this crisis, even though they're on opposite sides of the House, in the interests of the country as a whole. And I think the whole House appreciates both of them for the way in which they conducted themselves throughout this crisis. On the point that my honourable friend is raising, an acquaintance of mine who's an NH nurse asked the question, why is the public creating more work for us, medical staff, and exposing us to the risk of dying? And I thank my honourable friend for giving those messages so clearly. Does he think there's more that could be done to communicate more effectively to the public what social distancing means in practice and how people should behave, given the scenes we've seen this weekend?
I mean, I do agree with the honourable gentleman. I did note that the Secretary of State talked about the comprehensive public health advertising campaign, and we welcome that campaign. But we would encourage the Secretary of State to use his offices to see if that comprehensive campaign can become even more comprehensive? Could we have more adverts on television, more adverts on radio stations? Can we have a leaflet going through every door, for example, explaining what social distancing means, explaining what shielding means? Before this virus took hold, I don't think the words social distancing and shielding were used often in this chamber at all. So if they're not words that we are familiar with, we can bet that our constituents are not entirely familiar with, of course.
The Shadow Secretary giving way. He will know Telford and Wrekin very well. He's visited many times indeed in the last 12 months, flooding and other issues, and I'm grateful for his visits despite being an opposition member. Is he aware today that the Labour-led council, a decision, by the way, that I support, has decided to close all of its public parks and play areas and open spaces that it runs, and that in turn is going to cause more pressure on the other open spaces that are not currently run by the local authority? So can I encourage him to continue to press the government to move quicker to this lockdown that we all want to avoid, but will ultimately save lives?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his contribution, and I have to tell him my attempts to change the political complexion of Telford and the Wrekin have completely failed to date. But I am grateful for his comments. I'm grateful for his comments about the Labour Council, and I think this is the nub of the matter. It's a point I just want to put the Secretary of State, who, while he is still here. Sadly, we've just heard, or it's just been reported on social media that the case fatality figures are continuing to climb, and there is some discussion on social media that we are seeing now an exponential growth in line with Italy. Now, I appreciate there's different demographic issues in different nations, but clearly people are of concern that our death rates are increasing and at a rate which suggests we could be heading to an Italian-style situation. We all know what's happening in Italy. And I think the point is that we've also got at the same time clinicians telling us or warning us that our intensive care bed capacity, our high dependency unit capacity could very quickly be overwhelmed. We've already seen a critical incident at one hospital, and no doubt we will see more in the coming days. And this is a crisis, and it is a crisis which demands an overwhelming government response. Yes, of course.
I think it's vitally important that we have a sense of national unity on this. So if it becomes necessary for the government to impose a lockdown, which I suspect may well become necessary if people don't change their behaviour, can we rely on the opposition to support the government?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Gentleman has rather anticipated my point, because looking at the graphs, and I do caveat this with a recognition that different countries have a different demographic profile, but in terms of fatalities, we are now beyond the numbers when Spain and France announced their stricter enforcements, their lockdowns. I don't really like the term lockdown because it actually means different things in different contexts, but I think we broadly understand what we're talking about this afternoon. I would say, to answer the Honourable Gentleman's point, that we as a Majesty's Loyal Opposition actually do now call on the government to move to enforced social distancing and greater social protection as a matter of urgency. Because I'm sorry and disappointed, but I'm afraid that many people are not adhering to the social distancing that we expect. Yes.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for Health. Would he agree with me that he's absolutely right in the points he makes, but there are those that are finding it difficult to socially isolate themselves because of the financial circumstances they find themselves in, such as self-employed taxi drivers, those in the gig economy, and others who sometimes are actually just getting by in the first place. So there needs to be clear financial packages available to put those people on equal footing and provide that facility for them also.
Honourable friend is absolutely right, and it's a point that has been made repeatedly by my honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, and the Shadow Chancellor, and I put it like this. I think the challenge to social isolation will not be boredom and fatigue, as some of the behavioural scientists have suggested. I think the biggest challenge to social isolation will be personal finances and so on, which is why the measures that we have put forward on sick pay are so important. It's why we have welcomed some of the measures that the Chancellor announced last week, but we think they need to go further. I'll just give way to the Honourable Lady from Brighton, and then I'll make...
I'm grateful to him for giving way, and grateful to him as well for taking more seriously the issue of communications than the Secretary of State did. The point is that we do need leaflets going house to house, and we need them in different languages as well, so that different communities can actually hear this. His point about a strict lockdown is well made, but can I just echo what others have said about the importance of guaranteeing economic security to make it much more possible for people to actually cope with that, and in particular for those people who are self-employed, who are struggling so much now. Statutory sick pay is not enough for them.
Right, I'm very proud to represent the great city of Leicester, probably the most diverse city in the United Kingdom, where every language in the world is spoken. So I entirely endorse what she is saying. But of course, if we funded local government properly, local government would be able to put in place the sorts of measures that she is talking about. And of course, I entirely agree with her broader point that if we are having to ask people or force people to stay at home, then we would support the government if it took that action, and I think the government do need to take that action. Then we also need to provide people with the economic security that they rightfully deserve. I promise, I'm afraid, I'll give way to my friend Cardiff, then Wally, then I must make some progress.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and for the whole way in which he's approached this issue on a day-to-day basis. I completely add my support to what he said about the need for enforced social distancing, and I know that there are many members across this House on all sides who would support that. I've been struck by contact I've had with friends in Italy and elsewhere who are simply aghast, quite frankly, that we haven't moved to tougher measures sooner, and anybody looking at those graphs, anybody looking at the situation there, definitely wants to avoid that here, so I'd wholeheartedly support him, but it's got to come with those economic measures that he's rightfully talked about.
I totally agree. No more friend from Wally, and then I'll make some progress.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. And a lot of talk about income, but it's also about expenditure. I've had many complaints from constituents about prices rocketing, particularly for staples. What's really unclear is whether it's the fault of the retailers or the wholesalers and the cash and carry, or indeed of the suppliers. Now, I know the Competition and Markets Authority are looking into this. Can we, in his discussions, urge the government to do that urgently and, frankly, crack down on profiteering from people's difficulty?
Friend for Wally makes an excellent point, and we're seeing it in my own constituency, and I've had complaints from my own constituents about this exploitative profiteering. So I hope the government can come forward with some proposals to stamp it out. It is an absolute disgrace that this is happening at this time of national crisis. Honourable friend. And then.
Can I also raise the issue of, once again, of housing? Social isolation it is great, but if you happen to live with your family in one room in a shared house, as so many of my constituents do, sharing kitchens, sharing bathrooms, deeply overcrowded, this is a really difficult thing, particularly when the kids are off school. So there needs to be some thought about letting them out in parks and stuff like that, because they don't have gardens.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. I, like her, well, I represent in a city seat. I appreciate her seat is on the outskirts of London, but nonetheless, both our seats will have similar demographics. And I know full well that there are many, many families living in very cramped, small flats, intergenerational families with perhaps elderly mums, elderly grandmothers and so on, who will have various comorbidities, perhaps, who actually need to be shielded. So I hope, if we do go into a situation where we're forcing people to stay at home, that the government is looking at how to support these families. Because I do think it is quite outrageous that in many parts of the world, especially in London, but also in my own constituency, we'll have flats with families of 9, 10 people, people sleeping on floors, and so on. And then we have property developers who have flats standing empty. Why cannot we take over some of those empty flats to house some of these very vulnerable families to help us get through this national crisis? The Honourable Gentleman.
Can I commend him for the stance he's taking in this debate? I think the whole House will respect him for it. But the series of interventions he's just had, I think, demonstrates a rather wider point. And that is the need for the government, sadly, and I didn't think I'd ever say this in this House, but the government to get into intrusive levels of planning that we've never seen before. Because every time we have a change in the level of ferocity or whatever intensity of our dictation to what the state should do, what the society should do, we run into a new set of problems. Whether it is crowding on the tube trains, overwhelming our own desire to have social distancing, or whether it's young mothers
having children at home, finding very difficult to get to supermarkets and therefore literally running out of food, even more fundamental than running out of money. And so we need to think forward. And I say this because we've seen in Europe, between Germany and Italy and Spain, very, very similar levels of, or very, very similar policy actions, but completely different outcomes. And I suspect it's because of a different approach, maybe by the German government or German society, than the Italian or Spanish or whatever. And we have to think about that as we go into the next stage.
The Honourable gentleman is absolutely right. We are asking people, and probably on the cusp of forcing people to radically adjust their behaviour in a way in which we haven't been used to probably for 70 years, but more than 70 years. The last time we asked people to radically adjust their behaviour was in the Second World War. We have generations here who are not used to this. We're a society where we're used to going where we want, buying what we want, doing what we want, socialising when we want. And clearly, for a lot of people, it is not dawning on them that they are going to have to change the way in which they behave. And that does have huge knock-on effects. Knock-on effects for how public services are going to organise themselves, knock-on effects for how the criminal justice system is going to have to work, knock-on effects for how the food distribution systems are going to work. And it is right that we continue as parliamentarians to ask government ministers serious questions about that. But we also have to be aware that we have a responsibility to set an example to the country. We have to socially distance ourselves. So I really hope that the good offices of the Speaker and the Leader of the House and everyone who is involved in House business can quickly find a satisfactory set of procedures for us to continue having our discussions and asking ministers questions, but not setting the example that we are unfortunately setting today. I'm not making any personal criticism of any member because it's the situation we're in. We have to debate this bill today, but we are going to have to hold government to account on these far-reaching, extensive powers that they are taking. So perhaps I will, and then I must make some progress.
Yeah, I'm always listening with great attention to what he has to say. And would you agree with me, part of the problem with this is policy has to be based on behavioural science. Yeah. But behavioural science is one of the most imprecise of sciences. It's not like chemistry or physics. And there's the difficulty. And it means that we have to have a wide margin of error when designing policy. What that means, in effect, is erring on the side of caution and safety, which I think is the burden of the direction that he is urging upon ministers. And that, in a sense, is getting ahead of the curve by bringing in measures which we all would regret. But if we're going to base policy on behavioural science, it being fairly inexact and difficult to predict, as we've seen over the weekend, we have to have that margin of error, that caution, which I think is what he is recommending.
I think the Honourable gentleman has shrewdly interpreted the stance I am taking. Throughout all this, given the way in which this virus spreads so rapidly, and given its reproduction rates, and given the mortality rates, I have always urged upon the government to take a precautionary principle approach to every decision they are making. I have been a bit sceptical about some of the behavioural modelling that has been used. I mean, I'll just give the Honourable gentleman a quick example before returning to my remarks. I think we've all heard throughout this, before the government banned mass gatherings, we were told by ministers and officials, and I hope no minister takes this as a personal criticism. I certainly don't mean it. I'm not saying it in that respect, in that way. That there's no point in banning the football match with 70,000 people in the stadium, because the person with the virus isn't going to infect the other 70,000 people in the stadium. And actually, if you stop them going to the stadium to watch the football match, they'd all go to the pub and watch it there, and they'd infect more people at the pub. I'm sure the Honourable gentleman has heard the example. Well, I'm very proud to represent Leicester City Football Club in my constituency, and all the football fans, or a large proportion of the football fans, go to the stadium before the match and go to the stadium after the match. Pub, I beg your pardon, pub. They go to the pub before the match and they go to the pub after the match. And some of them do avoid the stadium, actually. Stadium's the opposite. Yes. You see, yes, they go to the pub. But you see the point, the Honourable gentleman sure sees the point I'm making. Some of these behavioural models don't always, it would seem, reflect how humans behave. And given that, I think ministers and government should be taking a precautionary principle at all times, which is why we are now urging government ministers to come forward with their plans for enforcing compulsory social distancing. There are different models in different countries, but we have France, we have Spain, we have Italy, we have New Zealand overnight, we have Greece, we have Germany banning more than 2 people meeting outside of their house other than families. There are different models across the country. We think the time has come for the United Kingdom to go down this line, and we would encourage the Prime Minister to come forward with plans for how he thinks it should apply in the United Kingdom. Okay, and then I must make a bit of progress.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. Behaviour is changing, and unfortunately some of it is unhelpful. I've had probably one of the most upsetting emails throughout this today from my local food bank, who tell me that 2 of the main supermarkets in the area are refusing to sell them food. The people who get that food from the food bank have no other means of obtaining food in the midst of this crisis. And does he agree with me that the government needs to speak urgently to the major supermarkets to ensure that food banks are able to secure sufficient supplies to supply people who have no other option?
It's a very good point, and I totally agree. That's an absolute disgrace, and I hope the government can look into that, because food banks shouldn't be necessary in this day and age, but we know they are so vital in this day and age, and I hope the government can resolve that swiftly. But so we would, to originally answer the Honourable Gentleman's point who asked it me so long ago, we would support the government if they came forward with such proposals. But suppressing and defeating the virus is about more than just so-called lockdowns and enforcement, however. We need more testing. We need more contact tracing. We need more isolation to break the chains of transmission as well. Because as the World Health Organization has famously instructed the world, test, 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 we agree. And on this side of the House, we have called for testing for the virus to be carried out within our communities on a mass scale, starting with NHS and care staff as a priority. We urge the government to rapidly scale up testing, and we also thank, of course, all NHS lab staff and PHE staff who are working so hard. Could the government consider, for example, what is happening in the Republic of Ireland, who currently have 35 community testing facilities in operation? They have 6 more planned. The largest one, Croke Park Stadium in Dublin, provides a drive-through service that is dealing with which tests 1,000 people per day. Okay.
I completely agree with him on the need to, in particular, protect all key workers and therefore make sure that there is testing available for them. But is it not important that at the same time we make sure that path labs have enough resources and capacity to be able to do, for instance, cancer biopsies and get them fast enough back to people, because all those other conditions and diseases which are very time critical will be just as important.
Absolutely right. Path labs, virology labs are under intense pressure, because not only are they being asked to test for COVID-19, they also have other testing responsibilities as well, whether that's HIV or influenza or measles or all the other illnesses which are still circulating and still have to be treated as well. So he makes a very, very important point. I just hope the ministers in response could just update us on testing capacity, because looking at the figures, it appears that between 21st and 22nd of March we did around 5,500 tests, but the previous day we did 8,400 tests, and the previous day to that around 8,100 tests. So I'm told that many labs at hospitals haven't been able to start testing or are currently testing at under-planned capacity because there is now supply chain issues with the relevant chemicals that are used and the kits to do the testing. If this is the case, could the government update the House on what they are doing to urgently procure the testing kits we need? And could the government also explain to the House why we are not currently part of the EU joint procurement project initiative for testing kits and indeed other equipment? And of course, I emphasise the point that I've made in this House before. that we really need to be testing our NHS staff. Not testing NHS staff puts them at risk, and it puts their patients at risk. This weekend we heard powerful messages from doctors, literally shouting out for help, telling us they feel like lambs to the slaughter because of failures in the distribution of protective kit and not able to get access to testing. I've heard of GPs, indeed GPs have got in touch with me directly, telling me they're going to DIY stores to make their own PPE kit. And indeed, one of the healthcare supply chain, distribution chains of today, it's reported, have put out a call to DIY stores, asking them to hand over their visors and goggles. Pharmacists are worried that they can't get through to CCGs to get the appropriate PPE when sick patients are walking through the door daily asking for advice. We've heard stories of community nurses, health visitors, paramedics without the PPE. And indeed, the Daily Telegraph reports today of staff at Northwick Park Hospital forced to wear bin bags because of a lack of PPE. The health, happiness and the lives of our constituents and their loved ones and neighbours depends on our NHS staff now more than ever. We shouldn't expect our NHS staff to go into battle exposed and not fully protected, lacking the armour they desperately need. If more PPE has been delivered in the last 24 hours, as the Secretary of State indicated, then we welcome that. But to be frank, it shouldn't have taken so long. Our NHS staff deserve every ounce of support we can offer. And on that front, could ministers also consider binning hospital car parking charges for NHS staff as well at this time of crisis? And those working in critical services more widely, our police, our care workers, our postal workers, need the appropriate protective clothing too. We urge the government to ensure all public services can access the appropriate PPE speedily. For example, in the Sunday Times yesterday, it was reported that flights continue to arrive at Heathrow from Italy, Iran and China. Those flights are obviously coming from hotspots. I mean, perhaps ministers could explain why that is still happening. But also, what protections are being afforded to airline and airport workers, and what measures are in place in respect of those passengers on arrival? And on the tube and on the train, there is real worry that services are being reduced too steeply, again, causing our key workers onto crowded carriages, putting everyone at risk. So what assurances can ministers give us that there is a sufficiency of public transport services to get our frontline workers safely to their workplace? Let me turn to some specifics in the bill. First, on health and social care clauses, which the Honourable lady from Twickenham raised with the Secretary of State. But first on the health clauses, the bill makes provisions for retired staff and final year medical and nursing students to rejoin the health service for the duration of the pandemic. We understand why and welcome this. Can ministers tell the House, either in response to the debate or in the committee stage, if final year nursing and medical students will be able to return to learning and complete more supported clinical placements if needed once the crisis is over? Can ministers also outline how these students will be fully supported while working during what will undoubtedly be an incredibly stressful time for new doctors and nurses? Will students be properly remunerated for their work? And what protections will be available for retired staff, many of whom could also be in the vulnerable group? And also I put on record our thanks to those retired staff who have returned to the front line. Madam Deputy Speaker, some of the most vulnerable people in the country absolutely depend on all of us here to defend their human rights and civil liberties. And that they are the ones in receipt of adult social care services. On social care, this bill makes sweeping changes to the duties which are placed on local authorities. It removes the duty to assess care needs, including on discharge from hospital, so there will be no duty to assess people who might need care or their carers, and no duty to assess some of those with the most severe needs who may be eligible for continuing health care. Can ministers reassure us that this will not mean that carers, disabled people and older people are left abandoned by the state until after this crisis? Most significantly, it downgrades the level of support which councils are obliged to provide to older and disabled people. Rather than the current wellbeing measures, councils will now have to provide services where necessary to uphold people's basic human rights. In short, this means that they will only be entitled to receive social care to keep them alive and uphold their rights to privacy and a family life. Obviously, this is not the vision of the social care that we legislated for in 2014, but we all appreciate these are incredibly difficult times. Many older and disabled people and their families will be concerned that this will lead to existing care packages being significantly reduced overnight. Local authorities are already struggling to meet statutory needs, and increasing levels of workforce absence will only make this harder. What none of us want to see is the new legal minimum of support become the default. Where local authorities can provide more comprehensive packages of support, they should do that, and they should always bear in mind that people who use social care are not simply passive recipients. They are doctors and nurses who rely on social care, as well as teachers, shop staff, food manufacturers and countless other vital professionals. When councils are reducing care packages, they must be careful not to end up causing yet more difficulties for staff in crucial services. Yeah.
Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. Would he agree with me that in a context where the courts are likely to be stood down and where disabled people often ensure that their rights are protected through the courts, that we're in a doubly difficult situation for disabled people and for elderly people?
Absolutely, and it's why these particular clauses in the bill have to be scrutinised and looked at so carefully by members across this House. We've put down amendments to Schedule 11 to recognise that we recognise there will be difficulties delivering social care over the coming weeks and months, but it should not be possible for local authorities to immediately drop care packages to a lower level. As long as it is reasonably practicable to do so, they should continue to meet people's care needs. The presumption should always be that services will be disrupted as little as they can be under the circumstances. Nothing in these amendments would stop a local authority cutting back care hours if they have to, but it would mean that disabled and older people can be reassured that any reductions in their care will be a last resort rather than their independence being the first sacrifice to be made. There are also particular concerns about people who live alone or are being held in inpatient units and care homes. We have seen visits to these settings stopped as part of the government's shielding approach, and the CQC have halted all inspections. But we know from incidents like Walton Hall that it's too easy for abuse to go unnoticed, something which the current situation could make worse. How will we ensure that some inpatient units and care homes don't become hotbeds of abuse of human rights over the coming months? Of course.
This is precisely the reason I asked the Secretary of State earlier on whether, when we get to the 6-month review and renewal of this business, that we will be able to amend the bill. Because if there are oppressive behaviour in one part or another, whilst the rest is all very, very important to the survival of our people, what stance will the Labour Party take on that?
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. We cannot just have a take it or leave it approach to these things, because we are the House tonight will give the government extraordinary powers like we've never seen before, and it's right that we as parliamentarians are given an opportunity at after the appropriate time frame to look how those powers have been used and hold ministers to account. So I think I agree with the spirit of the point the Honourable Gentleman is making, although I cannot at this particular stage, it may emerge later in the debate I suppose, but I can't at this particular stage give him a commitment on a particular amendment this way or the other. But we'll see how the discussions proceed throughout the afternoon. But I certainly endorse the spirit of what he is saying, because these are, as I say, quite extraordinary powers that the House will be granting to the government this week. But to come back to the amendment that we are putting down a new clause related to Schedule 11, and we are proposing that a relevant body, such as the Equality and Human Rights Commission, be tasked with overseeing the impact that this bill has on the provision of social care. They would have to report every 8 weeks on the operation of these changes and whether they should be amended. They would provide the oversight which is needed to prevent people's rights being undermined. One of the ways that the bill seeks to free up medical staff is by relaxing the requirements in the Mental Health Act. Specifically, it means that only one medical professional will have to agree to someone being sectioned rather than the 2 it currently takes. The scale of this change should not be underestimated. No longer will a decision to section a person have to be taken in consultation by two doctors. There will be no requirement for anyone involved to have prior involvement with the patient. Our medical professionals are going to be under huge pressure over the coming months, and mistakes may well be made. The bill says a decision should be taken on the basis of one signature if requiring a second signature would be impractical or require an unhelpful delay. This seems too vague and potentially open to misreading. I hope ministers can tell us what exactly this means and what safeguards will be put in place to prevent this change being misused. Our amendments to Schedule 7 would mean that this would be narrowed so that a second signature can only be left off if acquiring it would mean an undesirable delay. If something is impractical, it will, by definition, create an undesirable delay. By narrowing the wording in the bill, we can avoid, we believe, the potential misuse of powers. We are also proposing changes to ensure that private mental health hospitals cannot detain someone solely on the single recommendation of one of their employees. This could create a conflict of interest whereby a doctor comes under pressure to sign a detention authorisation because doing so will provide their employer with income from the NHS. No medical professional should be put under that kind of pressure, and our amendment ensures that it cannot be. Was the Honourable Gentleman seeking? No. The bill also extends the length of time somebody in hospital can be held waiting to be sectioned up to 5 days from 3. This may seem like a minor change, but for the individual concerned, it could make a significant difference. I hope ministers can reassure the House that the intention should still be to adhere to the timetables set out in the Mental Health Act, with the changes we are discussing today only to be used if absolutely necessary. Turning to some of the proposals on education and schooling. Many parents of children with special educational needs and disabilities will understand the need for flexibility during this difficult time, but they are also extremely nervous that they could see the erosion of their hard-fought-for rights of disabled children and young people, young people with special educational needs, particularly, and their families. The bill gives the Secretary of State powers to change Section 42 of the Children and Families Act from giving children rights in law to requesting public bodies take reasonable endeavours. We believe this sets a low bar and we'll be seeking changes to a duty to take all practical steps which will be much further. Moving on to some of the other issues in the bill, we are concerned, has been alluded to, that the bill has still not gone far enough in providing people with the incomes that they need in order to did I have a no? That the income that they will need in order to self-isolate. We welcome much of the Chancellor's statement last Friday setting out plans to support the incomes of workers impacted by the coronavirus outbreak. However, there are still some gaps in the provisions that were offered. Currently, as it stands, the proposals for income support through the Job Retention Scheme does not include the self-employed and freelancers, whose incomes are now increasingly being seriously affected by the coronavirus outbreak. Will the government today offer assurances to these groups of workers who don't have the safety net to safeguard and help them through this time? We have welcomed new measures by the government to improve access to statutory sick pay for workers. However, the bill doesn't extend eligibility to all workers, including the just under 2 million workers who earn less than the threshold to qualify of £118 a week on average. It doesn't raise the level of statutory sick pay, which is at £94.25, which is already the second lowest in Europe. It doesn't raise the level. So these are issues that we will hope the government would respond to quickly, because as we have continually said throughout this, people should not be expected to make a choice between their health and hardship. Madam Deputy Speaker, nobody also should lose their home because of this virus. And it's welcome that ministers have listened to Labour and committed to an evictions ban for renters. But despite promises made by the Prime Minister that the government would legislate for this, this is not currently in the bill. 8.5 million households rent their home from a private council or housing association landlord in England. Our analysis of government statistics show that 6 million renting households have no savings at all and are particularly vulnerable if they lose their job or have their hours cut as a result of coronavirus. To give people confidence and reassurance during this difficult time and ensure that no renter loses their homes as a result of coronavirus, rent needs to be suspended for those adversely affected by the impact of the coronavirus outbreak. Madam Deputy Speaker, like many members across the House, we as the opposition support this bill with a very heavy heart. Heavy not just with the shock and grief that this deadly virus has brought, but also with the very real threats that emergency powers of this nature pose to human rights. The bill contains the most draconian powers ever seen in peacetime Britain. Powers to detain and test potentially infectious members of the public, including children in isolation facilities. Powers to shut down gatherings, which could impede the ability to protest against the overall handling of the crisis or against the abuse of these powers themselves. It needs no explanation and very little imagination to understand the huge potential for abuse that powers like these and others in the bill, however well intended and needed, still contains. These words will chill every liberal and libertarian instinct of members across this House. And it's why we were grateful to the Health Secretary and the Solicitor General for discussing these measures with us and my shadow Cabinet colleagues in the rapid preparation stage of this bill. We've heard many wartime analogies in the press. Many here have talked about Winston Churchill. Of course, Churchill not only was remembered for victory in the war, but he was remembered for the European Convention on Human Rights at the end of the war. So notwithstanding the Anti-Human Rights Act and anti-judicial review grumblings we've heard in recent times, this bill comes under cover of a statement of compatibility under Section 19 of the Human Rights Act. Further, the bill does not attempt to oust the supervisory jurisdiction of the courts. That means every single exercise of executive power and administrative action under this legislation must and will be measured against human rights and common law standards. These include necessity, proportionality, rationality, fairness, and crucially non-discrimination. I thank the government for this concession on its part and for agreeing, I hope once and for all, that human rights and the rule of law, far from impeding national efforts in times of crisis, should instead guide and inspire them. It's important that various measures in this bill, some interfering with liberties and other deregulating standards, may be turned on and off as and when needed by the appropriate administration under our devolution settlements. It's welcome that the bill contains a 2-year sunset clause, but Madam Deputy Speaker, as we have discussed, 2 years is a very long time in normal days, longer still in the context of this pandemic, which is why we, on this side, tabled an amendment last week seeking parliamentary votes on the renewal or revocation of these emergency powers at 6-monthly intervals. Indeed, many of us would prefer even more frequent reviews, but given the particular challenge, even for Parliament of this crisis, I am glad the government seems to have moved some way towards the compromise offered by the opposition in the constitutional interest. I hope, of course, and then I
welcome the spirit in which he's making his speech and also his proposal for review at 6 months, and I certainly support that. But would he agree with me that we could sunset the powers in this bill after 1 year, and the government could then bring forward a bill? There's plenty of time to do it between now and then, and that bill, which would go through Parliament about this time next year, could make whatever changes prove to be necessary between now and then, and would not involve us today signing off on 2 years. So 6 months review, and then after a year a bill.
Well, as I understand it, our amendment is calling for a review every 6 months. But the Honourable Gentleman makes an interesting point, which I'm sure that the ministers will respond to in the committee stage and when we get to that point later on. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope the government will be able to explain the differences between their amendment and ours and reassure the House that there will not be large exceptions to the 6-monthly review, especially in England, which has only this House to hold executive power to account. We have been scrutinising this bill on behalf of our constituents. None of us came into politics to put a bill like this on the statute books, and I, for one, will never rest until the day, hopefully not too far away, when I can come to this House to vote to get rid of this bill. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we have seen in recent months is concerning, if not frightening, all our constituents. And it is right that we are taking the powers that we are taking today, although we have to continue to hold government to account. We will overcome this virus, Madam Deputy Speaker. And when we do, serious lessons will have to be learned. The crisis has exposed the vulnerability of a society in which insecure work is rife, deregulation is king, and public services are underfunded. When we come out on the other side, as we will, we have to build a society that puts people first.
Order. It's been very important that Honourable and Right Honourable members have had the opportunity to intervene on the Secretary of State and the Shadow Secretary of State, but that has inevitably meant that the opening speeches have been somewhat longer than normal, so therefore there is immense pressure on time. I would say two things. Those who have intervened a lot might feel that they had made their points and might not want to continue to make another speech. There is also, I would point out, the committee stage where a lot of issues have been raised. But it's very difficult to see how everybody's put their name down for this second reading debate, which has to finish at 8 o'clock. It's difficult to see how they can all get in, but I would start by urging colleagues to stick to 5 minutes, obviously not the leader of the SNP, but that way we can hopefully get as many people in as possible. Jeremy Hunt.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Health Secretary, quite understandably, is not in his place, but I wanted to start with a tribute to him. I think I am the only person in this House who's sat behind his desk, and I can testify even without a pandemic it takes years off your life. And this Health Secretary has made himself exhaustively available. He has worked tirelessly, and no one could have done more or better to prepare the NHS for the crisis we now face. And I also want to thank the Shadow Secretary of State for the way that he has risen to the challenge of his role, and all of us as parliamentarians are proud of the exchanges that we've had this afternoon and on many occasions. Ordinarily, our role as MPs is to scrutinise every detail of legislation, to understand it, to try to improve it. And there are many questions about this legislation, but we are in a national emergency. And every day we delay could cost lives. So I support this bill 100%, and I encourage all colleagues to do the same. A week ago, the government said we were 4 weeks behind Italy. That then changed to 3 weeks behind Italy, and today our mortality rates are just 2 weeks behind Italy. Our hospitals, especially in London, are filling up. We've had a critical incident at one. Others say they're running out of ICU beds. According to the papers, we have one nurse fighting for her life in an ICU unit. One London hospital has 7 doctors in just that one hospital, also with the virus. And yet still, people are going to shops, parks, beaches, holiday homes, as if nothing has changed. It may be too late to avoid Italy, but to have any chance at all of doing so, we must move to lockdown rules now that ban non-essential travel. It is time not just to ask people to do social distancing, but to enforce those social distancing rules. Not next week, not this week, but right away. So I support the call made by the Shadow Secretary of State to do that, and I think it's very important we do so as soon as we possibly can. There are 2 areas I think this bill could help with. The first is on protective equipment for staff. Last week, Sir Simon Stevens told the Select Committee that there were sufficient national supplies of PPE, but distribution problems. And since then, I know the government has moved heaven and earth to try to resolve those. All hospitals have had deliveries, and I pay tribute to the Health Secretary and everyone at the HSC for doing that. But there is still a lot of concern on the front line. And the main reason for that is because on March the 6th, Public Health England downgraded the recommendations as to what